Thanks, Ben, for sharing those links. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Danica. I also work at SERPED. I'm going to introduce the rest of our team here in just a moment. But I think we can get started. So this presentation that we're about to go through is in the meeting materials link that Ben shared in the chat. So if you want to follow along there, there's also some other materials related to the plan that you can review later on, and some links and information about next steps and how you can stay involved in the process. So I encourage you, if you haven't already, to check out that link and save that file. And yes, if anyone has any questions at any time during the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll be sure to pay attention, and we can stop and answer questions as we go along. So again, welcome everyone. This is the first public meeting for the Assawampset Pond Complex and Nemasket River Watershed Management and Climate Action Plan. A mouthful, so I'm just going to refer to it from now on as the Watershed Management Plan. So this is our first public meeting on floodwater management. So before we dive in, we're going to start off. I'm going to introduce the rest of my team here in just a moment, and then we will go through a overview of the project, kind of background, how we got to where we are, and our vision for the watershed and how we hope to achieve that vision through this plan. Then we're going to talk more specifically on the topic for today. So floodwater management, we'll talk about the issue as we understand it so far, as well as potential management actions that can be taken to address some of those issues. And this is where we want to hear from you. So we're going to have a long discussion with all of you to learn how you're experiencing these issues currently, and ideas for different management actions and priorities for different actions. And then we'll come back and talk about next steps for the plan and how you can stay involved. So the project team for this project, it really is, it all started with the Assawampset Ponds Complex Management Team, which is a group of representatives from the 4 communities that are within the watershed, so Middlebury, Rochester, Freetown, and Lakeville, and then the 2 communities that get their drinking water supply from the ponds, so the cities of New Bedford and Taunton. And there are representatives from each of those towns who have been a part of this committee for years now. This is not a new committee. They've been around for a while, and they really are the driving force behind the management and protection of the Assawampset Ponds Complex. And there are also other representatives on the committee from local groups like the Middlebury Lakeville Herring Fishery Commission, and regional and state agencies, as well as some legislators and even local volunteers and residents. So they really have been the driving force behind this effort for a number of years. And then more recently, in the past couple of years, they have pulled in a team of consultants to help with this longer term planning process. So that team is comprised of my team at SERPED, which is the regional planning agency for Southeastern Massachusetts, our environmental program. So myself, Danica, Ben, who's also on the call tonight, and then Bill and Helen, who are at our in-person meeting currently in Lakeville. And then Courtney Rocha is the MVP coordinator for our region, and MVP is the supporter and funder of this management plan. The Nature Conservancy is a project. We have Maria Gabriel and Sarah Burns from the Nature Conservancy. Of course, Lee Witten Group has been consulting on this project. So we're joined tonight by Ellie Baker, and then Neil Price from their team is also has been working on this project. And then also with us tonight is Eric Wahlberg of Wahlberg Consulting. So now just a quick background of how we got to this point where we're putting together the plan. So the Assalamsett Ponds Committee has been working to implement management actions for the ponds for a number of years, and there's been a lot of studies that have been done and recommendations have been made on how to better manage the floodwaters and drinking supply and environmental issues in the ponds. And just a quick reminder, can everyone keep muted when we're not speaking? You can definitely unmute yourself later for the discussion, but during the presentation, it'll just help to keep down the background noise. Thanks. All right, so so kind of the role of this management plan is to pull together all of the past studies and efforts that have been done and all of the past planning and the recommendations that have come out of these past efforts and combining it into one comprehensive plan. So this management and climate action plan is kind of like the big tent that covers all of the previous work that's been done. And the reason why we're doing this is to kind of approach the issues that we're seeing from a systems level and kind of looking at the whole system and looking at everything that's been recommended in the past, as well as pulling in new actions that maybe haven't been identified yet, or maybe from this public meeting series, new ideas from the public that we haven't yet thought about. And then kind of weighing all the options and looking at how they fit in together, and then turning it into an actionable path forward where we can actually prioritize which actions are most important. And then also kind of compare them with each other to see what are potential trade-offs, but also what are co-benefits and maybe which solutions we can implement that will tackle more than one issue at a time, because that will kind of help with the prioritization process. So that's kind of the background of what we're trying to do. Now I'm going to turn it over to Ellie, and she's going to talk more specifically about the goals of the management plan and what we're doing more specifically.
Thank you, Danica. Good evening, everybody. Ellie Baker with the Horsley Witten Group. So the project goals that we're working, ultimately we're working to develop a watershed management and climate action plan, as Danica just said. And this plan, we had to organize it in a certain way to try to sort of mesh all of these ideas together. So we're addressing existing conditions and existing issues, but we're also trying to look at future conditions and sort of what we envision is sort of coming down the pike in the watershed. And we know that there are certain overall watershed issues today, such as, we have an example here of seasonal drought within the watershed. There's also episodic flooding that's occurred and has been documented. There's habitat challenges, invasive species, a limited recreational access. It's obviously a water supply. And so trying to organize all of those management issues into a logical manner has been sort of part of our initial stages of this watershed plan. So we basically organized the management issues into sort of 8 essential topics or 8 essential management challenges. So those include drinking water supply, ecology and habitats, floodwater management, which we'll be talking about in more detail today, land development, recreation and access, water quality, stewardship. And then we also are looking at and considering interagency cooperation. Obviously, we recognize that to make changes in the watershed requires cooperation. So that's kind of how we've set up this watershed, the planning for this watershed plan. And not only are we looking at those issues as sort of overall watershed issues, but we're also trying to look at key pinch points in the watershed where some of these issues come together, either to cause disruptions, or maybe even to create great benefit. So one example is something like water movement and the challenges of water movement between the Assalamsett Ponds complex and the Nemasket. There's also pinch points such as certain developed areas that cause disturbance in the watershed, or other dams and culverts, for example, that might limit flow in the watershed. Next slide, please. So as I said, not only are we kind of looking at the existing known conditions in the watershed, we are also trying to incorporate into our plan the dynamic forces that are shaping the future. And really what we mean by that is we know things are changing. The status quo is no longer the status quo. We have climate change, which is sort of changing the boundaries of what we're dealing with. And we also have new development. There's always conversion of land in the watershed that we'll be thinking about. So with climate change, for planning purposes, we are considering impacts that are anticipated for 2050 under what's called the high emissions scenario, or the RCP 8.5. This is a very common terminology for climate change thinking, but just to let you know what this is, if you haven't heard it, RCP is the Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5. And that just means that there's a whole suite of scenarios where we think about what the future emission scenarios might be. RCP 8.5 is considered to be sort of the highest or among the high emissions scenarios for carbon emissions. But it's also thought to be, when I say among the high emission scenarios, among those scenarios that have been evaluated by climate scientists. And this emission scenario has also been noted by many scientists as of late to best reflect sort of our current trajectory or the upper bound of the current trajectory of carbon emissions. In other words, this is, even though it's a high emission scenario, it's also generally likely to happen. So that's what we took into account. Our plan extends out over a number of years. So we're looking out 30 years at 2050. And then I'll also talk about what we're doing with new development. Next slide, please. So what does this climate change scenario actually mean in our watershed? You know, trying to translate that scenario, this emission scenario, into what changes can we expect? So what we can expect in the watershed essentially are some changes in the heat and changes in rainfall or precipitation. So we can expect between 15 and 33 additional days of really hot days each year by 2050. So that's a big change. What does that mean for us? Well, more really hot days results in more evaporation, greater energy needs for air conditioning, greater public health concerns, as well as shifts in habitat as a result of heat changes. We're also going to see, or can expect to see, much more precipitation each year. Right now, we get about 44 inches in a year, and we can expect to see about 2.5 more inches in a given year by 2050. And that increase is also expected to occur in winter and spring. So in addition to that, we can also expect essentially more variability in the way our rain falls. So we're going to have more extreme rainfall events and also longer dry events. So essentially, more variability in our weather patterns and the way that our rain falls. Next slide. We also know that we're going to be experiencing continued development in the watershed. The watershed has been growing. It will continue to grow. And we have a way to incorporate those projections into our thinking about potential impacts in the future. So this map here is an example of some modeling that we've done to look at the potential full build out of the watershed under existing zoning conditions. So what this allows us to look at is, if everything were built out under existing zoning as much as we could, where would the development occur? And you can see the bright yellow and bright red on this slide along 495 essentially are, that's the corridor where we can expect to see a lot more development in the future. And what this does for us is it allows us to start to think about how to manage the impacts of that future development within this watershed plan. So we're also incorporating these climate change and development predictions or projections into the management plan considerations. Next slide, please. So one key element of this management plan is that it is a living document. So this is not the be all and end all of how to manage the watershed, but it is a really helpful roadmap for how to move forward in the watershed, but it is absolutely meant to be updated in the future to reflect changes that occur, changes in priorities, et cetera. But this management plan should give a framework for how to organize actions, how to organize consideration for different impacts, et cetera. It's also going to have a substantial focus on managing these competing ecosystem services or competing needs of the ecosystem and people in the watershed. So we know, for example, that increased recreation, that may challenge some water quality concerns or create some water quality concerns. Water supply capture, we want to have as much water as we can in the water supply, but we also want to be able to manage for flood control and flood mitigation. So those create a little bit of a friction, a little challenge to balance. And that's totally natural. That's how ecosystems work. That's how watersheds work. And so we're trying to identify those, those different competing services and find solutions and actions that help to best balance those. Next slide. So I find it useful when we're going to go through a discussion like this for all of us in the room to kind of revisit what the vision is for the watershed. And I don't know how many people on this call are familiar with this vision statement or not, but this is a vision statement that was developed with the help of our project steering committee. It's not set in stone, but this is what we're working with at the moment to sort of guide our management. And the vision helps to ground our discussions and kind of remind us what we're striving for. So before we move on to the next section of this, which is really a little bit more in-depth discussion of floodwater management, I just wanted to read this aloud and kind of set the stage for what we're doing. So the vision for the future of the watershed. Overall, in 2050, the Assalanted Ponds Complex and Nemasket River are healthy, sustaining life and natural communities, including our own, through clean, safe, and reliable water supply. The inhabitants of the watersheds have greater protections from climate hazards and have developed an environmental ethic based upon choice, not chance, that drives sound local and regional decision-making. So that's what we're striving for. And I'll turn it over to Eric now. We're going to have a little bit of a presentation about floodwater management in particular in the watershed.
Great. Thank you, Ellie. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm glad you could make it. So as Ellie started to describe, tonight we're really going to be focused on floodwater issues, but we're going to, through a series of public meetings, deal with a number of different interrelated topics. So while the framing that I'm going to go through on this slide is certainly pertinent for our discussion tonight, just be cognizant that we're going to take a similar approach as we go through other topic areas in subsequent public meetings. So certainly we're going to be concerned with what the known issues are around floodwater management, and rest assured that the project team has done a lot of due diligence. But one thing that we find is sort of meeting after meeting is that as new individuals come to the table, they have their own experiences in the watershed. And so we're really looking forward tonight to having the benefit of your experience and your knowledge of the watershed. And I'm sure that's going to help us build up a more complete set of issues. The second point here, what impacts have already been observed? Certainly there's been a history of significant flood events in the watershed, and we've spent a fair amount of time with the emergency response folks in the towns surrounding the ponds complex. And with that, we've started to build up some mapping that we're going to share with you, but certainly interested in hearing if you know of a particular flood-prone location in the watershed. Would like you to add that information in our conversation. Ellie already started to unpack a little bit about climate change on one of the subsequent slides. I'm going to go into that in some detail. So hopefully that'll start to sketch out what we're concerned with as a project team in that regard. Ellie started to describe the possibility of trade-offs and co-benefits. That really is part and parcel of our thinking on this plan. In many cases, we do have some tensions to be concerned with. One of the dominant ones is that obviously the ponds complex is a drinking water supply. So we have a need to maintain, an adequate amount of drinking water in the ponds. And then on the other hand, it's a system that is prone to flooding. So immediately, we have a tension in that area, and that, sort of notion of some competing concerns, sort of cuts across a lot of different topic areas. And then we're really, when we get to the matrix discussion tonight, we're going to be talking about potential management actions. We've already started to populate a matrix that explains some of that. But again, we're looking for your input to help really build that out. So next slide, please. Okay, I'm sure that most of the folks in the meeting tonight are familiar with some of these issues, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, this watershed does have some underlying characteristics that really does, it sets up, there's a predisposition for flood problems, unfortunately, in this part of the world. One element is topography. This is a relatively flat watershed. So during those very wet periods where the soils are saturated and there's a lot of rainfall, there's just not a lot of topographic relief to move that water out of the watershed rapidly. In terms of soils, this is an area with a lot of wetlands and therefore a lot of hydric soils. During drought periods, that can actually be a good thing because those are areas that tend to store water. During a flood event, when those areas are saturated beyond holding capacity, that can become part of the problem. And then certainly because of these first two characteristics, it makes it difficult to site development where it's not in harm's way in terms of flooding. And so we've got a situation now where a lot of pre-existing development is in harm's way in terms of flood hazard. And one of our real focal areas going forward is to try to sketch out a future where we could minimize the extent to which that problem is exacerbated by new development. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this image is the Fema flood zones. And again, I'm sure this is an image that a lot of you are familiar with. The areas shown in green and blue are what are known as the 100-year flood area. Now, one of the issues we're going to talk about with climate is that we're starting to get sort of bigger, heavier rainfall events. Things are getting biased in that direction. So this is a bit of a moving target, and certainly we should all be expecting that both the 100-year flood and then we've got the 500-year flood area shown in orange. Those are areas typically a bit further away from the edge of the ponds complex, slightly higher in elevation. But we have every expectation that this map of flood hazard areas is going to change a bit over time. And likely, we're going to see a larger footprint of flood hazard areas. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the map I referred to earlier, and this is where we've started to compile in what's called a geographic information system or a computer-based mapping system. What got flooded during the last really big flood event, which was roughly 10 years ago. So what we've got shown here in red are areas where there were tremendous flood issues. Areas shown in blue highlight road closure areas. Now, certainly there was some intermingling between those categories. And then we've got, over on the right-hand side, a number of bullet points that just highlight some of the areas that suffered some of the worst impacts. Now, this is certainly not to say that there aren't other areas in the watershed that have flood problems. And again, as I said, certainly part of what we're about with these meetings is trying to get a more complete picture of where people have had problems. Next slide, please.
Hey, Eric, this is Ellie. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think it might be helpful if you lean in a little to your microphone. I think it's getting a little.
Okay, is it clipping some?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. So in terms of climate change impacts, and I already started to talk about this just a little bit, but what we're seeing over time, this is particularly pronounced in the northeastern portion of the United States, but we're seeing a shift away from sort of mild and moderate precipitation events, and an increase in the percentage of precipitation that we get in very heavy downpours. And I know that everybody's seen this on the news over the last few years. It's not just New England, this is throughout the US and in Europe as well. But in New England, we've got a bit of a double whammy in that, we're getting more precipitation on an annual basis over time, but we've also got this biasing towards very heavy precipitation events. The mechanism is that as the atmosphere warms, it can hold more water vapor, and when it comes out of the atmosphere as precipitation, it can come down in buckets. Already started to reference increased total precipitation, our second point here. So that's the total amount on an annual basis going up over time. And then we have warming temperatures, and I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of a tug of war that we've got going on as the climate warms. And even though we're talking about flooding issues, we also have to be cognizant of the other side of the coin, if you will, and that's drought conditions. And so as temperatures warm, we're getting a longer growing season. That in conjunction with higher evaporation rates during the summer can lead to a situation where things dry out more rapidly. And so I just want to point this out because it's part of this balancing act that's going to have to be considered in terms of managing drinking water supply on one hand and thinking about the flood threat on the other. So, just to, again, sort of tee up this idea of thinking about trade-offs when we talk about possible solutions. So next slide, please. Okay, also though, we've got trade-offs, but we've also got the possibility of some genuine co-benefits to be had. And one of the approaches that the project team is looking at is thinking about where we might do environmental restoration or some additional land conservation, and how we might get a couple of different benefits to line up. On the one hand, improved flood storage, and on the other hand, improved habitat quality or ecological vitality. So certainly it appears that there are some opportunities. We'll talk a little bit more about those specifically in the matrix discussion. Just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here, in a parallel project where some modeling is being done, looking at the dam at the Assawampsett Palms complex, it appears that there are some opportunities there for redesigning that structure that may both allow increased flow during flood events, therefore reducing the amount of time when flood conditions are experienced, but also may present some opportunities to reconnect some of the wetlands that are just downstream of the dam. And again, that could do good things in terms of floodwater storage, but could also be more vital from a habitat perspective. In stormwater management, certainly we've got some similar opportunities where the extent to which we can improve local infiltration of stormwater, that does good things for groundwater recharge, can help you deal with drought situations, and could also be a good thing from a flood management perspective. In that same vein, if we can infiltrate stormwater on site, that does good things for reducing non-point source water pollution. We're also going to talk about a couple of other areas in the matrix discussion, including interagency cooperation, where we might get better alignment between, say, roadway management and some of these concerns we're talking about tonight. And then finally, thinking about future land development and how that might affect some of these issues in the watershed. Next slide, please. Okay, so the categories that we're going to talk about when we get to the matrix discussion are what we've got listed here on the right. So we're going to have an opportunity to weigh in on how we might do a better job of storing flood water. That might be some of the wetland and floodplain restoration that we've talked a little bit about, helping the floodwater flow. That might be some dredging work, removal of vegetation. Some of that might be infrastructure fixes, making rules that limit danger from floodwater. MOUs as an example, improved floodplain regulation, et cetera. Avoiding floodwater. This might be a situation where repetitive loss properties are actually purchased, and that could be federal money, state money, local money, some combination of those three. And then building infrastructure that limits dangers. One of the things we've heard about again and again this project and some previous work related are a number of culvert issues where you've got undersized culverts that are exacerbating flood problems. And then thinking in terms of possible green infrastructure fixes, increased use of grass swales to absorb floodwater. Next slide, please. All right, so at this point, I believe it's going back over to Danica. Is that correct?
Yep, thanks, Aaron.
Yep. Okay, well, thank you.
So alongside all of these potential management actions, there's also this question of how can we address some of these through our local regulations. So as part of our assessment process, we're doing a regulatory review of the communities in the watershed to answer some of these questions about how they can address the issue of floodwater through local planning efforts and land use regulations. So specific to the floodwater topic, the questions we had in mind are how are communities regulating development in the floodplain? Are we protecting the floodplain and wetland functions, so protecting their ability to store floodwaters? How is the regulated floodplain reflective of future storm events? So Eric showed you that map of flood hazards and talked a little bit about the 100-year storm and the 500-year storm. All that means is the probability of which a storm is going to happen, whether it's a storm that's likely to happen once every 100 years or once every 500 years. The issue with that data is that it's based on previous trends. And as we talked about, we know that precipitation trends are changing. We're likely to see more frequent, more intense storms. So if we're reflecting the 100-year floodplain, it's really likely that that storm is going to be occurring more than every 100 years. So maybe we should start looking out towards the 500-year floodplain. So that's what we're trying to get at with that question. And then how can we protect or relocate the existing development and infrastructure within the floodplain? So kind of like the buyout option that Eric talked about to avoid floodwaters. And lastly, our community is adequately prepared to respond to recurring extreme flood events. So our team kind of thought about these questions, and then we picked out a few different regulatory mechanisms that we felt would have the greatest impact at resolving some of these issues. And so we did a review of the communities in the watershed. So we looked at Lakeville, Middleborough, Rochester, and Freetown's local regulations to more specifically, we looked at their wetlands regulations, their floodplain regulations, and their hazard mitigation planning. So we did a review of those topics for the 4 communities, and I'm going to give a quick overview of that right now. And then this is the last portion of our presentation, and then we're going to dive into discussing some of the actions. So just a heads up that we're almost done talking to you. So for the wetland bylaw review, we found that all Middleborough, Freetown, and Rochester do have wetland bylaws. Lakeville does not have a wetland bylaw currently, which doesn't mean that wetlands aren't protected at all. There is a state Wetland Protection Act that has basic protections that apply across the state within wetlands. The point of adopting a local bylaw is that you can protect wetlands above and beyond what the state protections are. So you can regulate a larger area, so like the buffer area surrounding a wetland, which is really important because having a healthy buffer helps to protect the wetland, so it has improvements for water quality and flood storage. So if you're regulating a larger area and protecting that larger area, it's going to have benefits for both habitat and floodwater storage. And then, so that is why you would have a local wetland bylaw. Lakeville, as I understand, it's not from lack of trying that they don't have a wetland bylaw. They've had some challenges getting a local bylaw passed. So I just want to throw that out there and not say that I'm like offending Lakeville because they don't have a bylaw. It's definitely not easy to get one of these together and passed. So of the towns that do have bylaws, we found that Middlebury, Freetown, Rochester, they're all regulating larger areas than the state area. So Middlebury protects the regulates the 25-foot buffer. Freetown has a 100-foot buffer for wetlands and a 200-foot buffer for river, lakes, ponds. And then Rochester has the same as Freetown. So what this means is that any activity or development that's going to take place within that buffer area has to be reviewed by the local conservation commission, and they have to issue a permit for that activity. In addition, we also looked at how activity is regulated or approved within those areas. So again, that floodplain, the 100-year versus the 500-year storm that we were talking about. Are communities regulating the 100-year floodplain or larger? And most of the communities here either didn't specify or are regulating the 100-year floodplain, which is the typical regulation. And then additionally, what activities are prohibited versus allowed in the wetland area. So we looked at that. And having stronger prohibitions on preventing activities will obviously help to prevent flood issues. So the communities here are mostly prohibiting structures, any type of structure within a wetland, in some instances, the towns are, Rochester is the only one who has a strict no activity zone. So within 20 feet of the wetland, you have to have a strong case to get a special permit or a variance in order to do that. And then for Freetown, it's no activity allowed within 200 foot of lakes, rivers, and ponds. And then lastly, mitigation requirements. So as a last resort, if the activity has to take place within the wetland or a buffer, requiring the developer to make up for that by restoring a wetland elsewhere. And then for floodplain bylaws, each of the communities within the watershed has a local floodplain bylaw and a local floodplain overlay district. So this identifies the area of flooding. So in the case of all 4 communities, it's the 100-year flood elevation that's being regulated. And this is an overlay district. So whatever the underlining zoning is, the regulations within this district are in addition to whatever the underlining zoning is. So given whatever is allowed in the underlining zoning, in this overlay district, there are additional restrictions on what can't take place. So across all communities, any alteration of that flood level, so if anything were to happen, if a structure were to be placed or the floodplain were to be altered such that it would cause higher levels of flooding to the community, that wouldn't be allowed. And that's pretty standard across all 4 communities. And then permitted uses, again, pretty standard across all communities. They're allowing So no structures, but allowing agriculture, forestry, nursery, outdoor recreation, conservation uses. So all types of uses that don't require hard structures and facilities. In some cases, temporary non-residential structures are allowed. So if it's, say, like a structure for fishing or to sell crops that are grown on the lands there, then that's allowed. And then Middleborough additionally allows some residential uses if you have residential properties such as lawns, gardens, parking, and storage, which is important to note because altering those areas for parking or a lawn, that could have impacts on the floodplain. So that's important to note. And then lastly, we looked at hazard mitigation plans. So we wanted to get at the idea of, so the previous two regulations regulate future development, but how do we address a development that's already existing? So one way to do that is through hazard mitigation planning. So that is a plan that communities can adopt locally for how they're going to deal with natural hazards and prepare for. Another reason why we chose to go this route is because we wanted to explore the options for that buyout program that Eric mentioned. And there is a statewide program that's under consideration at the state level now, and there might be future legislation to implement a statewide buyout program. So if through their hazard mitigation planning, communities start thinking about this now and coming up with strategies to identify where are ongoing flooding issues happening and documenting that, then they can theoretically be ready for this program once it's implemented. So Freetown and Lakeville do not currently have hazard mitigation plans. Lakeville is in the process of developing one now. Middleborough and Rochester do have plans, but both of them are expired. Rochester's is a bit older. It expired in 2010. Middleborough's recently expired in 2020. So we looked at Middleborough specifically for this since it's more recent and more relevant, and we pulled out some recommendations. We pulled out the information from that plan in this chart on the right here. So overall, for the flood vulnerability assessment in Middleborough, and I think this applies across the watershed, they're seeing high frequency of flood risk, extensive severity when floods happen, and it's affecting limited geographic areas. So not necessarily the entire community or the entire town, but there are neighborhoods within the community that are seeing these impacts. So again, the hazard mitigation plan looks at the 100-year floodplain and records 100-year flood events, which have been recorded in 2010. There were 2 events during those large 2010 floods. It records locations where floods have happened, and then it also records losses. So Middleborough participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, which is how homeowners can purchase flood insurance. So as of 2010, when this data was pulled, there were 34 flood insurance policies. And since they joined the program in 1981, there had been 20 claims and 15 were paid out. And they only identified one property. So this was between 1981 and 2010. So this information is a bit dated. One property that met FEMA's definition for repeat flood loss. So meaning that they had multiple flood events that resulted in losses. And this is the information, this is kind of what we're looking to track in order to participate in a buyout program, because that type of information is what can help us identify where repeat losses are happening and what areas might be good candidates for buyout. So that is a quick summary, but the reason why I'm sharing this is because from this review, we're going to pull out more specific recommendations that are going to be part of the matrix in our next discussion. But knowing more thoroughly what regulations each community has, we can help to make recommendations and also to help streamline these updates and recommendations across the community. So all 4 communities can kind of approach this together and adopt similar regulations rather than each community working on its own. So that's another thing that we're going to be looking at for our plan. So now we're going to move into a discussion of all the potential management actions. So they're organized into those topics that Eric showed before for storing the floodwater, helping it flow, avoiding the water, and so on. So what we're going to do is I'm going to switch over to an Excel document where we can look at this together, and we're going to do it one topic at a time. So this matrix, what we're hoping to collect from you is information on what are your thoughts on the actions that we've identified. Are we missing anything? Has any of this maybe happened before that you want to share whether it was successful or not? Just to get your thoughts and also which you think are higher priorities. So we're going to capture that within the notes. And then also what you're seeing on this chart here is the colored columns on the right. Those are kind of the trade-offs and the benefits. So as we look at each of these solutions, floodwater is the topic we're talking about today. The other topics we're going to be talking about in future meetings are water quality, drinking water, stormwater management, ecology, land development, and so forth. How does this action interact with those other topics? So would this action be a co-benefit, so B for benefit, or does it have the potential to be a trade-off? And that's a T. So that's what that is. And then the last column, which we won't get to tonight, but I just want to share it just so you know that we're considering this, gets at future climate impacts. So will the action, the recommended action, be successful given future climate change impacts, changes in precipitation patterns? Will it last into the future? So for every action that we're considering, we're making sure that we're looking at it not as a solution for now, but a solution that's going to last well into the future. So just noting that that's there. So now I'm going to show the questions that we are going to ask you. So like I said, do you agree with the issues that we've identified? Have we missed any? Do you agree with the strategies that we've identified? Have we missed any action strategies as well, issues or strategies? What do you think will or won't work? Which actions do you think we should be prioritizing over others? Have any of these strategies been tried already? If so, did they work? Did they fail? What worked? What didn't? Because that will help to inform our recommendations. What are the potential trade-offs and co-benefits? And then additionally, any ideas or recommendations or general thoughts you want to share with us. So I think we're going to copy and paste this list into the chat so you can have it for reference.
Weren't taking junior this weekend.
We also have our expert facilitators, Ellie and Eric, are going to walk you through this exercise so they can help remind you the questions as well. So I'm just going to switch over to the Excel document. And as I'm doing that, does anyone have any questions on the presentation so far before we get into this discussion? We're happy to answer any questions.
Yes, I've got one. This is John Morse. What is the relationship between APC and the Southeast Regional Economic Development Organization?
Sure. So SERPED, the Southeast Regional Economic Development District, is the regional planning agency for southeastern Massachusetts. So the communities that lie within the watershed are members of our region and our district. And our role is we provide services to communities, particularly planning services. So under this grant to develop this plan, the the APC committee has asked for us to support them and provide consulting support and planning support. So that's the role there, where you can think of us as a consultant that the committee is hired to go through this process. Thank you for asking that. Okay.
One more, since nobody else wants to jump in. Assawampset Pond has a set point which is supposed to be regulated. It's the set point, I think, is 93.1 feet above mean sea level. My question is, I know that there's some automated system that sends water levels to some place electronically every day. And so my question is, why hasn't the level of Assawampset Pond been maintained at the set point, which I thought was agreed to by all parties this year? I mean, this set point was agreed some time ago, but why hasn't it been maintained this year?
So I can't speak to whether it's been maintained this year. If anyone else on the project team would like to jump in, please do too as well, if you know more. But there is an agreed, so like Eric kind of taught, and Eric and Ellie both talked about how maintaining the levels at a certain point, try to getting at that sweet spot where the water level is high enough to maintain the water supply, but not so high that it's causing flooding issues. So you're right, there is an agreed level that the communities have set and try to maintain at. And I know part of the management structure for that has to do with the Assawampset Pond Dam, and how to manage that and improve that structure is something that we're looking at as part of this planning process. So I can't speak specifically to what's been going on this year, but I can tell you that it's something that is a consideration within this plan. I don't know if Ellie or Eric, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I can jump in with just a couple of thoughts. And, you know, the problem in the past has been, you know, sort of either an undershoot or an overshoot of what would be an optimum level in the pond. And a lot of that's weather driven, but it's also infrastructure driven. And, you know, if you've got, you know, not enough water coming in, there's not a whole lot that can be done about that in those periods where there's too much water and you get a flood event going on. The existing dam, even with all the riser boards out of it, just takes a very long time to drain the system. So that's, you know, certainly, you know, we're cognizant of some of those issues, and that's part of what is a driver for this project.
Thanks, Eric. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I wanted to just get the Excel sheet up here. So this is the what we're going to be walking through our actions. So again, this is the overview. We have on the left-hand side over here are all the management actions. I'm going to be taking notes here on your comments and your thoughts, and then you can also look at the trade-offs and the benefits that this solution, implementing this action, would have with other topics. And then again, will it survive future climate conditions, which will be a consideration further down the line, but not something we're trying to look at today. So we are going to go one topic at a time. So I have each sheet organized by topic. So I think I'm handing it over to Eric now to facilitate the discussion around here.
Yeah, great. So as has been mentioned previously, you know, we started off populating the matrix really as a way to get this conversation going, and we've got folks on the project team that are going to be taking notes. We're not going to try to actually edit the matrix online tonight, but we will be recording your comments And then we'll take that and we will produce an updated version of the matrix based on that input. So, we'll be noting the conversation down. Now, just to make sure we're all on the same page about, the structure of this, and Danica's already started to unpack that. But for each of these topic areas, and in this tab, we're looking at storing of floodwater. We've got a couple of examples here to get the conversation going. And then as you look at the columns over on the right, water quality, drinking water, stormwater infiltration, et cetera, we've started to put some thinking in there about situations where you see a green square and there's a B there. That's where we get some co-benefits potentially between, the actions shown over on the left and the intersection of these different topic areas. Where you see the orange color and a T, that's what we see potentially as being a trade-off situation where you're going to have to kind of weigh one issue against another. The T with the brackets around it is a situation where you have a trade-off, but maybe not quite as serious. So anyway, now, these are generalizations. So, obviously, there's a lot of the devil's in the details on this stuff. But again, we're just trying to frame things up to get your input. So I'll walk through this topic area by topic area. I'm going to do this tab and the next tab on the matrix, and then I'll pass it over to Ellie. But this is the part of the program where we really want to hear from you. So please feel free to weigh in and ask any questions that you've got. Any clarifying questions. So the first action that we've got here under storing floodwater is restoring or enhancing wetland areas that act to store floodwater, with the idea being that this could both help infiltrate stormwater and could help store moisture over time, so that when we get this sort of seesaw conditions that I spoke to earlier, where for some months we might have flood situation, but then we go into the summer months and we've got the other side of the coin, which could be a drought. We're trying to think about solutions that would contend with both of those extremes. So just to give you a couple of examples of the kinds of projects we might see in this first category, as you all know, there are a lot of cranberry bogs in the watershed. Again, no surprise to anybody, the cranberry industry is under a lot of fiscal stress, and in other parts of the state, there have been bog owners that have decided that it's time to move on and to take the bogs out of production. So the state has a very active restoration effort. Oftentimes there's funding available to landowners to help push that along. So that's one example of one category of wetlands restoration that might occur. Another that I mentioned previously is a lot of the wetlands area just downstream of the APC dam. It's a degraded system, a lot of invasive species. So it may be that there's a possibility for sort of a win-win situation where some restoration there could help with the flood issue, but could also be a boost from an ecological perspective. So questions or thoughts on this topic area? Yes.
I would just like to point out that when we recently went kayak down the Nemasket River, it was amazing. This was actually below the area that is in the purview of this study, but I think it probably is true upstream as well. The Nemasket floodplain is extremely flat, and it was amazing how much the water spread out over all of that stuff that I think you might be referring to as invasive species. We couldn't find the channel. I mean, we found ourselves just crisscrossing over and taking all kinds of shortcuts and getting lost because the water had spread out so much.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And just to be clear, we are considering the Upper Nemasket, in this project. So that's certainly fair game. There has been some work done recently to go in and start to try to clear some of those invasive plants out. So that's certainly on our radar screen, but you make a great point. that, it's a system that has, sort of degraded ecologically over time. And I think there are some real opportunities there to both address flooding and upgrade or deal with some of the habitat degradation. So, yeah.
Actually, the point that I was trying to make, Eric, is that the flooding was already spreading out far and wide. I mean, it was amazing how far and wide it was able to spread there, because there were so many wide places that the floodwaters were overtopping.
Yeah, and that's very much characteristic of this watershed. I mean, certainly I think we can go a long ways in this project to sort of minimizing some of these issues. It's not likely that some of those sort of baseline characteristics of the watershed would ever totally be overcome. And what you're describing is just kind of par for the course in terms of the flat topography in this part of the world. So yeah, it's a good point. Anybody else want to weigh in? This is really, your opportunity as participants. All right, we'll move on to the next category. And, if you think of something that pertains to a previous category, please jump in. So another possibility, I was going to move on to the second item. If you can go back one slide. So the second item in the first column under possible management actions here is to expand wetlands into upland or disconnected, disturbed areas and protect buffers, creating additional storage capacity. So this certainly relates to the first category, but it would deal a bit more with some of the adjacent uplands. There may be situations where you've got prior conversion of wetlands to other uses. And so there may be some opportunity to pivot that back to wetlands. In other cases, we might think about land conservation or land management adjacent to the wetlands. So again, it's trying to be forward thinking. The idea being that likely we're going to see larger flood footprints over time due to climate change. So it's trying to be proactive. So any thoughts or questions on that one?
Just as a question, is there kind of a knowledge base about costs and benefits for these different approaches?
Yeah, there's a lot of literature to lean on. And I mentioned before, there's a parallel project that's concerned specifically with the Upper Nemasket. And in that, a number of different infrastructure options are being modeled. And so with that, there'll be some quantitative comparisons made. And then we're hopeful that over the long haul, we're going to be able to do a larger hydrologic study for the whole watershed, which would include the APC and the Nemasket, and would get at sort of a hard-nosed quantitative look at some of these trade-offs. Right now, we don't have that specific information for this watershed, but as I said, there is a great base of literature from projects in other places that give you a good qualitative assessment. So. Other questions, comments, thoughts? All right, well, why don't we go on to the next tab? And like I said, if you think of something that you'd like to comment on a previous tab, that's fair game as well. All right, so now we're sort of shifting, and now admittedly, all of these things overlap, so it's a little bit hard to tease them apart totally. But we're really, we've got a set of items here that are more concerned with helping floodwater to flow. Now, a lot of these items that are listed here are more in the vein of infrastructure fixes. And there are a number of different projects that have taken place prior to this. In particular, many of the localities in this region have been through a state-funded effort to put together a climate action plan. And as part of that, they assessed local problems associated with flooding. So a lot of this information was gleaned from that state-funded effort. So I'll just walk through this, and questions, comments are fair game. And certainly if you think or you know of other situations that should be included on the list here, that's fair game as well. So the first is replacing culverts at the Snake River and Route 105. I'll just read them off, and then we can open it up and people can jump in. So reconnecting the Assawamsett Pond Dam to the adjacent wetlands. We've already spoken to that a couple of times. Restoring the Nemasket River channel. As I said, some of that work is already underway. I believe some dredging work is being assessed as part of the hydrologic modeling that's underway. So we'll get some more definite answers on that. Removal of the Bascule Dam, which is downstream of the APC, but could certainly address some of the flooding issues on the upper Nemasket. Replacing the railroad bridge over the Nemasket, removing sandbars. There's a typo there. It's supposed to be sandbars. And MassDOT broken drain, and this is in the area of 495 and Route 44. Replacing the Plymouth Street Bridge in Middleborough, replacing the Murdoch Street Bridge in Middleborough, and the Cross Street Culvert. With that list, open it up for questions, comments, or thoughts about additional items that should be on this list. And this is the time, if you know from your years in the watershed of a particular problem area that doesn't show up here, this would be a great time to, get it on the list, and it'll be something that can be considered.
Is the dam at where Assawamsett joins the Nemasket River? Is there any plan to look at that to make it more efficient? I don't see that.
Yeah, that's actually, that's a great point, and that's a separate but parallel study. And in fact, we just reached a point where within the last week or so, the engineering firm that's looking at that came back with a number of different redesign options. And in fact, several of them really would make substantive improvement and the residence time of floodwater. What it would do, it would increase the rate at which floodwater could be moved out of the system. So that's not part of this specific effort, but it is being worked in parallel. And those two things will come together.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the fact that you're looking out to 2050, but what I don't understand is where is the management responsibility today in maintaining the level of Assawamsett Pond? It seems like a pretty straightforward thing to do. I know there are a lot of variables, but if we can't maintain the level of the pond today, or if no one is actively working on that, I'm interested in what's going to happen next week. And I'm certainly interested in what's going to happen in 2050. But the lake level should be managed.
No, I hear you, and I'll give you my read on it, and certainly would encourage other project team members to jump in if they want to add information. But my understanding of the current situation is that even if you take all the riser boards out of the existing dam, it doesn't drain rapidly enough to deal with flooding issues. I mean, it will come down over, many, many weeks. And so, what we're seeing from some of the modeling work is that a redesign of the dam as one element in this could, in fact, make an important difference. It's not the only piece of the puzzle, but, I think, the simple answer is that right now you've got some infrastructure in place that is not really up to snuff in terms of being able to adequately control levels. I mean, anybody else on the team want to jump in on that? Do you agree with that? Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that John Morse realized that the next item, reconnecting the Assawampset Pond to dam adjacent wetlands, is designed to improve the speed with which the pond would come down, because it would mean additional places where the floodwater could run out. I don't know if you're familiar with the dam, but there's a long causeway that goes to it. And my understanding is that one of the things that's being considered, he's going to talk about it in a minute, is having flow through certain places in that causeway.
Yeah. I mean, the different options for dam redesign that are being evaluated would involve broadening the spillway considerably. So that element wouldn't in and of itself be this wetlands piece we're talking about, but it would need to be done in conjunction with it. So those things would work together. So.
Thank you.
Can I ask kind of a background question? I'm newer to this than I suspect many others, but what are the sources of the water into the complex? We're talking about getting water out of it, but where does the water come in? Is it all groundwater? Are there particular rivers or streams that flow in?
Yeah, and again, other folks on the project team, please jump in if you'd like to add to this. But my understanding is it's really a groundwater-driven system, as you suggest, and where the flooding problems come are during periods that are very wet with precipitation, so that the soil gets extremely saturated, and you exceed the ability of the system to drain rapidly enough to avoid, it's just almost like a bathtub that backs up during prolonged periods of precipitation.
So there aren't upstream solutions, so to speak.
Yes, there's not like a particular river that flows into it that's causing the problem. I mean, this is really the headwaters of the system, and you've got an area where groundwater moves in along with surface water over, as we've said several times, a fairly flat topography. And so when you get extended wet periods, it just backs up and there's not much place for it to go. So.
Thank you.
Danica, this is Ellie. I don't know how easy it would be for you to go back to the PowerPoint, but it might be helpful to just show the watershed boundary again.
Yeah, that probably would be good.
Slide 5 or 9 has a good watershed boundary. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, actually, if you can do the one with the FEMA flood zones on it, that's a good talking slide for this. Yeah, there we go. Can you go full screen, Danica? Is that possible?
The moment, Danica, we're seeing the presenter's view.
Oh, I'm in the wrong mode. Sorry.
Sorry, I missed you up.
Let me try that again. Thanks for pointing that out. Here we go. That's better, right?
There we go. Great. Thank you. Okay, so the black line is the watershed boundary. And then if you see the dark blue line that runs sort of through the center in the upper portion of the screen, that's the upper Nemasket. Danica, could you point the dam just so everybody that's not familiar? So that's where the dam is right there. And so, basically this is a fairly flat watershed, precipitation and groundwater flow in, accumulate in the ponds complex behind the dam, and then work their way down into the Nemasket. At the very top of the map, where the blue line and the black line intersect, that's the Nemasket eventually dumps into the Taunton River, and that's what eventually drains to the ocean. So, and you can see just by the prevalence of flood-prone areas shown in the green color, the blue color, and the orange, that you've got, low-lying flood-prone areas pretty much throughout the watershed, which again kind of speaks to the problem. So, Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah. Great. So any other questions on the watershed? No, we'll go back to the matrix. Ellie, did you want to add anything before we go?
No, I think that was a helpful overview. Visual.
Okay.
Good.
All right. Great.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. So back to the matrix, please. All right. So
Matrix now, right?
any other questions or thoughts on what we've got here? If not, in the interest of time, I'm going to pass it over to Ellie and we're going to move on to the next tab. But any other thoughts or questions? All right, and certainly if you sort of ruminate on this and think about something that ought to be on the list here, a project you've heard of or has been discussed in your community, please reach out to us and let the project team know. So, Ellie, I'll pass it over to you, and you can move on to the next tab, please.
Okay, great. And just to remind folks that there is a packet that a PDF document that's a packet of information, and this information is all in there. So if you do want to think about this beyond this meeting, you can certainly look at that packet and get back in touch with us. We would really appreciate it. So we're going to move on now to sort of rules and regulations, sort of a regulatory approach to limiting the dangers from floodwater. There are a number of different things that communities can do in a sort of a rules or regulatory fashion to protect resource areas and protect property. Essentially, a lot of this is actually focused on protecting property and keeping property out of the flood zone or away from harm's way in the flood zone. So as Eric did, I will read through what some of these options are, and then we can talk about them in a little bit more detail. But just so you get a sense for what they are. The first item here is that communities can pursue participation in FEMA's community rating system. This is basically a checklist process where a community can do a bunch of things in their community to improve the flood protections in the community. And they can participate in the FEMA the FEMA insurance process. If you go through the community rating system and you do a certain number of good things related to flood mitigation in your community, then you can get it's a scoring system. And the better your score, the better your ability to reduce the flood insurance rates that your community members will pay. So it's a way to reduce flood insurance rates within your community. And what we're talking about doing here is perhaps working with communities to do this on a community basis, but it's very cumbersome to go through the process. It's time intensive, staff intensive. And so one approach may be to take a regional approach to this community rating system. So essentially having some sort of regional collaboration, maybe through a staff person or an organization that would facilitate enlisting in this community rating system across the whole region. So that one, just to help communities get through the process, essentially. And in doing so, you reduce the flood insurance rates for your community members, but you also, logically reduce the flood risk to your community members. So all of these things in the community rating system sort of checklist are good things to do. So one way to go through this process is to be fully in the community rating system and actually take advantage of all of that, reduction in insurance, or you can use the checklist as a guide for sort of good things you should do to reduce flood risk in the community. So what we're talking about there is, basically doing that on a regional basis. And actually that was kind of a mouthful. So rather than reading the rest of them, I guess I'll just stop there and we can, I'll put it out there and see if anybody has any thoughts with that or familiarity with this process and wants to comment on that. Or if any communities have tried this. I don't think that they have in this watershed, but I'm not certain of that. Okay. Well, if there's no comments on that one, I'll let that one sit for a minute and we'll move on. So the next one is to review memoranda of understanding and procedures with entities such as MassDOT, MassDOT that have a role in scheduled maintenance for drainage, sedimentation, road management, those kinds of things that basically affect the drainage system within the community. So making sure that the agencies that are dealing with road and drainage maintenance are really doing the most that they can be doing to address maintenance issues. The next one is to limit development in the floodplain, and this goes to the idea of floodplain zoning and improved wetland bylaws that we heard about from Danica. Similarly, adopting a local stormwater bylaw that accounts for more intense storms. So as we talked about, we're already experiencing some change in our rainfall patterns and storm intensity, and we expect that to continue. So how do we address that within our local stormwater bylaws to require strengthened stormwater management? And then similarly, we can do that at a local level, but also the state has some purview over stormwater management, particularly through both the MS4 permit, which some of you may be familiar with in communities, but also through the State Wetlands Protection Act. So the State Wetlands Protection Act that applies everywhere to wetlands across the state also has embedded in it some stormwater management standards for projects that drain to wetlands. So it may be worth supporting efforts at the state level to also increase their stormwater requirements and their design requirements to address sort of future or anticipated storms. The next one is transfer of development rights bylaw. So I don't know how familiar folks might be with this concept, but the idea is that you create an overlay district, or basically two related overlay districts in a community that identify an area where you want to discourage development because it's sensitive, and an area where you want to encourage development because it's less sensitive and for other reasons related to transportation or other reasons you might want to encourage development. So you set up a system within your local bylaws where people can essentially trade development rights from one location where it's undesirable to another location where it's more desirable. And that's a way of sort of directing development to places that are less sensitive. And from what we understand, this has been under consideration in Middlebury, and Lakeville has considered it in the past. So it might be familiar to some of you from local discussions, and if so, we'd love to hear some thoughts on that as well. And lastly, identifying and codifying low impact development approaches into zoning and subdivision or site plan bylaws. So low impact development approaches are things like limiting impervious cover within a proposed development site. So if you have a proposed commercial site, you can limit the amount of parking or the size of the building so that you're limiting the impervious cover. You can also incorporate different types of stormwater management practices or disconnection of impervious cover to allow water to drain and infiltrate into the ground rather than draining to a centralized drainage system, which sometimes may exacerbate flood issues. It could also be something that like a cluster development or open space residential design development bylaw that you can incorporate into your subdivision requirements. So that's kind of the suite of regulatory or rules-based options that we've identified. So I would love to open it up to your reaction to any of these, whether you think these are reasonable for certain communities or would be helpful. And also if you know that these are already under consideration or recently under consideration. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
I have to say my first reaction is that a huge portion of the land around the complex is already protected. You know, nobody, I mean, it's owned by the New Bedford Water Department, and it's can't be built on to begin with. So that it seems like most of these are solutions that might apply kind of well away from the ponds themselves and other parts of the watershed. But nobody's going to be building major parking lots kind of in the immediate area of the ponds because they can't build anything at all. Or the area around things like Long Pond are pretty fully developed. And unless you're talking about kind of there are already a lot of restrictions on what further development might happen there just because of the way the land is laid out.
So thank you for those comments, Alan. One thing to keep in mind too is that we are talking about the watershed also to the upper Nemasket. So that does include some of the more urbanized areas north of the ponds. But you're right, a lot of it is protected. But I would also encourage folks to look a little bit more at the level of protection that's in place, because sometimes protections that, you know, they seem protected or it's been that way for a long time. As development gets, you know, a little bit more pressing, there might be some loopholes there. So just examining those in a little more detail is sometimes valuable. Does anybody look at one of these and say, no way?
Could you expand on the statement right there at the top? Make rules that limit dangers from floodwater. What are the dangers that you're? What are the specific dangers that you're referring to?
Yeah, that's a good question, John, and that's some tricky language that we've been playing with. So most of these actions deal with the dangers to personal property, essentially. And that's kind of the framework within which a lot of flooding is a problem because we put our development in the way of natural floodplains, essentially. So we are trying to protect, in this particular element, we're trying to, basically mitigate the impacts of flooding on private property so that flooding is no longer a problem, right? If water could flood wherever it wanted to and it didn't bother anybody, it wouldn't be a problem. So we're in a situation where it is a problem. And so we're trying to mitigate the flooding and mitigate the damage from the flooding that does occur. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm reminded of the 2010 high water event that we had that basically closed Route 18 over between Long Pond and Assawampset because the water was over the road. So I see that, unlike, that's not private property, but it's a byway that needs to be open in case you have an emergency of another kind. I mean, no emergency of vehicles could pass, ambulances couldn't pass. The roadway was completely shut.
Yeah, John, that's a good point, and that's a good correction that I should make. It's private property, but I mean public property as well. Infrastructure, right? We want to protect infrastructure, and I would say there's also this idea of transfer of development rights. You might want to. That might be a little bit broader than what we're talking about, because transfer of development rights may be a way to pull things out of the floodplain or to a buffer to the floodplain just to allow it to function better and to avoid, I guess it is, property or infrastructure damage, but you're trying to avoid putting something in harm's way. So it's not in harm's way yet, but you don't want to put it there.
It does seem like this might also speak to the state level efforts to increase the size of the storm. for construction projects, that could apply to public construction projects as well.
Right. Right. So there is already some effort underway to increase, to change. There's, some of you may be aware, there's a stormwater manual that is used to design stormwater management systems across the state. And it's required under the Wetlands Protection Act across the state, but it's also adopted by reference by many local bylaws. And that document is currently being, they're considering updates to that document at Mass DEP to incorporate, to keep it in very simple terms, essentially to incorporate better, more recent rainfall data so that the design storm that people use is more relevant to current days, to current, data, but also to essentially add, for lack of a better word, I'm just going to say, to add a little bit of a buffer to that and increase it a little bit to address future anticipated storms as well. So there is likely to be, I don't know, I think it's fair to say there's likely to be some changes there, but I think there could be, maybe some push to have additional changes related to stormwater and flood management. Did anybody have any reaction to the community rating system approach? Or questions? Okay, should we move on to the next one, Danica? All right. So these are possible management actions that address building infrastructure that limits dangers from floodwater. So essentially, this comes down to elevating roads and addressing our stormwater, the existing drainage system. So the first item here is to elevate Bedford Street instead of replacing culverts, considering elevating the street altogether. The second one is installing green infrastructure to reduce runoff from properties abutting the river. So anywhere where there are properties abutting the river, rather than having direct impervious cover directed right towards the river itself, could we put in green infrastructure to allow it to infiltrate, or at least to slow it down? Infiltration may be difficult in a lot of these areas, but at least slow it so that you don't have these peaks running into the river. And by green infrastructure, I think many of you know what this means, but essentially green infrastructure are sort of vegetated processes or processes that allow water to infiltrate or detain, so that you're trying to mimic natural processes in the way that we manage stormwater from a site. And then the last one is installing green infrastructure to mitigate flooding along roadways. So either installing or retrofitting things like swales, what we often think of are country drainage systems, but trying to sort of disconnect roadway runoff throughout the watershed. So those are a couple of suggested management actions. I'm sure there are more within this category, but I will open it up for your thoughts.
It seems to me that the elevate Bedford Street, solves one problem but doesn't solve others, whereas replacing the culverts gives you much more ability to manage the flow of water between Long Pond and Assawamsett. If you elevate Bedford Street, all you're doing is increasing the barrier rather than improving the flow.
So one idea with that is to elevate it as in a bridge, which would be a big
To open it up.
project, obviously. Any other thoughts? I can't see everyone on my screen, so if you want to just speak out, go ahead.
Yeah, one other, and it's kind of you've got that marked as a trade-off under water quality, and you have a subtable invasive there. But the other thing is that increasing the flow is one thing, but I think it's important to recognize that there's a lot of things that flow from Long Pond into Assawampset, which are more than plants or vegetation. Because it's such a heavily used pond, there are contaminants from gasoline, motor boating. It's a compare the water quality of Long Pond and Assawampset. Assawampset's a secondary water supply, but Long Pond is I think you would think it'd be the opposite of a water supply. So all the stuff that's generated in a dense population, a dense recreation area, flowing into Assawampset has its own set of unintended consequences.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. That makes a lot of sense. Any other comments or reservations about these ideas? Okay, we can move on to the last, short and sweet, last one. So this category is avoiding the floodwater altogether. And again, it's a little bit of an imperfect topic header there, but essentially what we're talking about is there are places that are already experiencing flooding or multiple events of flooding. And one way to get people out of the way of the flooding, get property out of the way of the flooding, and get infrastructure out of the way of the flooding is to buy out the properties and just move them out of the flooding altogether. So the idea here is to create on a regional basis a buyout program. Help folks that are in this situation. There is a buyout program that is run through FEMA right now, which some of you may be familiar with, but it's cumbersome to go through. It's cumbersome for an individual. It's cumbersome for a municipality to go through it. But again, trying to do this on a regional basis, and maybe trying to work with the state so that they manage it rather than FEMA managing it, may be one approach here. So the idea here is to try to streamline that process, create a process that addresses very specific issues in the watershed that exist now or that may exist in years, and be prepared for that by working with the state and trying to create something that would work quickly and effectively. So reactions to that idea and additional thoughts as well on any other options for, ways to get people out of the way, get property out of the way, get infrastructure out of the way.
Yeah, I would think that would be way down on the list of priorities, because there as you pointed out in your previous slide, there are management techniques that can be used to avoid or mitigate the outcomes of flood. And I guess I didn't mention specifically, but a management action that you could add to the previous slide, because Assawampset is the largest of the ponds, and because water flows from Long Pond into Assawampset, it seems to me that a management protocol should be in place today, which anticipates and takes prompt and effective action when the water exceeds the set point. So you have a set point, the water exceeds it, you have a variance, and then you have a protocol written to address the variance. It seems like a pretty sensible thing to do. I think the buyout is going to be very, 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 very complicated. I don't know how that could be done. And of course, it would be difficult to buy out one section of one pond's community and not buy out another one. It's just going to be a difficult process, I think.
We already subsidize the flood insurance for a lot of those houses. In some ways, the buyout is a trade-off of a big expense now as opposed to a lifetime of flood insurance subsidies.
It would be great if some of the neighborhoods that were built before the Wetland Protection Act went into effect, those neighborhoods, and especially in Lakeville, that were filled in wetlands, if that fund was big enough to really attract people to abandon those houses and let that land go back to the wetlands that it was previous, that could be substantial storage. But I mean, I think that the account or the fund that would need to do that would probably have to be pretty big. I think it's probably the one drawback I see with that part of it.
Yeah, that's a good thought, Chris. So rather than just looking at areas, directly along the river and the ponds that are flooding, looking at areas that used to be wetland. So doing this for the purposes of wetland restoration is an interesting idea. I guess I would just put it out there too, John. I appreciate what you expressed about putting this at the bottom of your list for reactions, and that's part of what we want to hear from all of you, is sort of what things jump to the top is really important, and if something's less important, that's helpful to know too. I think this buyout program idea, whether it's appropriate and really useful in this specific area or not, I think remains to be seen. But it's not, that discussion probably would not happen, in isolation in this watershed. It's happening in a much more broad context around coastal communities and buyouts, et cetera. So it is part of kind of a bigger discussion as well.
The other place where I think it will come up is when you get into the discussions about water quality, that there are, I think, probably a huge number of homes in the Long Pond area whose septic systems fall well below the current standards, and who, for zoning rules and for cost, can't afford to upgrade them to what would be required. And in those cases, I think some kind of a buyout process might actually be very attractive to some folks. They can't sell their houses as they stand now, and they can't afford to replace the septic systems.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea too, Alan. Thank you.
Can I add one more off the wall thought. I specialize in those, which goes back to the flow only tab. And there, in a sense, the point is, how can we send more of the good, clean water we've got in these ponds down the river and out to sea? And I wonder whether it would be worth thinking about opening up the use of the water to the other communities in the area at times of high water. Right at the moment, Taunton and New Bedford are the beneficiaries of the pond. Is there any possibility that you say to Middleborough, Lakeville, Bridgewater, we set up a pumping system so when the water is high, you shut off your wells and start pumping from the ponds and make use of the water rather than just sending it downstream?
Thank you, Alan.
I don't know if there's
comments.
Even outside the realm of science fiction feasible, but it seems to me it would help maintain the groundwater that those towns depend on and be more effective use of the water in the ponds than.
Trouble is, in times of flooding, the other people don't want the water.
Well, I mean, what would it take for Middleborough to pump into the water tank from the ponds rather than from the 6 wells or whatever are in town?
Yeah,
would it make a difference?
Interesting thought. Thank you, Alan. We welcome those.
We could set up a great big bottling plant.
Any other final thoughts on any of this? I know we're getting towards the end of our time here, so I just want to be cognizant of that. And if not, I think I am turning it over to Ben for some closing remarks, next steps. But before I do that, just thank you all for your time tonight and your thoughts and participating. Hopefully you will take a look at the materials, the little packet that's available to you, and certainly share some additional thoughts if they come to you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. And a big thanks to the project team for a great presentation. And to everyone who attended today, we really appreciate your feedback and all of the really amazing points that you've given the team to think about now. If you would like to learn more, read any of the background documents, kind of learn more about kind of some of the context, you can visit the project webpage. The link is here. I'll also drop a link in the chat, and I can also send this out afterwards in an email. And to make sure that we do have your email, if we could ask everyone once again to just quickly fill out this sign-in form. I just sent it out in the chat box. That would be really really helpful. So continuing on with this topic, we do have two options for you to share any thoughts or feedback about this session tonight. You can visit this comment APC-Nemasket link to leave us any comments if you have any additional thoughts or any other ideas regarding any of the pertaining to any of the comments or actions that we talked about this evening. That link is also here. And we also do, truly, if you do have truly anything, please feel free to put it in that form. And we do have an interactive activity. It's an online flood reporter where you can see essentially previous flood events over the last couple of years, particularly pertaining to the 2010 floods. And has an opportunity for you to drop a pin or a point and identify particularly chronic or unique flooding events in your community. So, Danica, would you be able to open up the reporter really quickly? If not, I could open it up on my computer. I just want to take people through a quick visual walkthrough of that.
Oh, it looks like my computer's cooperating.
Oh. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, so once you click the link to this reporter, that little text box has some instructions for if you would like to on how to use the flooding reporter. All of those this map with all those crazy colors on it, you may recognize that those are FEMA flood, the FEMA flood zones that we discussed earlier in this session. And if you click on, thank you, Danica. You click on that little box right there, you can see all of the other different layers and information that's available. And this contains, again, some information on flooding events from like the 2010 floods. And we would really love to learn more about, if there was a flooding event that happened maybe this summer with all the storms that we had. We would love to just kind of fill in the gaps. And you can do that by just clicking on that green button in the lower right-hand corner where it says Add Flooding Instance. And this will ask you the type of flooding. If it's a chronic flooding that happens every time there's a half inch of rain, or if this is more of a unique flood event like the 2010 floods. So you can click on that, type in a quick comment of there was such and such, this is what it looked like, this is the impact, this is how long it took to recede. And once you fill all that information in, you can just zoom in on the map, thank you, Danica, drop a pin on it and then click report it. And that'll pop up in the map later on. I think you might have to put a quick comment on it, but yeah, you can cancel it. You'll also be able to see the comments that other people left and the pins that other people left and comment on those. So if you see that someone has already put a pin or has identified flooding in your neighborhood, you can just give it a thumbs up. There's a whole lot of information here. I don't want to go too far into it, but basically, one layer to particularly note is the this green and purple layer. Yeah, thank you, Danica. These are different ideas or interventions from the matrix that we were just discussing. So this is, if this were to happen, say for example, we were to look at protecting parcels along the Nemasket River or removing the Bascule Dam, these are the geographic locations at which those interventions would happen. If you have any questions at all about the map, I'm also available over email. So certainly feel free to please reach out, and I can also share my email in the chat. And thank you so much for bearing with me. The final thing is that this is an ongoing process. This meeting is the first of many. And we would love to see you at future meetings. Our next meeting is going to be on October 13th in Taunton. That's going to be located at the Hopewell Pavilion. And there'll also be an online version. That meeting will be hosted both in person and online. And the online version will actually use the same Zoom meeting link. So if you want to, just take this Zoom link and put it in the calendar reminder for the 13th, then that should still, that would function the same. Yes, and thank you, Danica. If you like to register for future meetings, that link that Danica just sent out in the chat is where you can do that. Yeah, I think that is all on our end. There will be future meetings about water supply, recreation, and land development, and we really appreciate it. We'll love to see you all there.
Thanks everyone for your time tonight. We really appreciate it.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation this afternoon. I'm going to introduce our panel. We have Maria Gabriel from the Nature Conservancy, Helen Zinkovich, is that close enough? Yeah. Okay, from Serpad, and Bill Napolitano, who probably everyone knows from Serpad. And I'm Nancy Yates. I am the environmental manager of the Assawampset Pond Complex, and that's where the grant that we received from Municipal Vulnerability has come through the Assawampset Pond Complex Management Team. So I'm going to turn it over to Maria Gabriel this is a 2-year grant, and we're just at the end of year 1, starting year 2. And Maria will bring us up to speed on what's been happening.
Thank you, Nancy. Yes, so I'm Maria Gabriel, Freshwater Manager with the Nature Conservancy. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate you taking the time. It's very important to us to get your input and feedback. I'm going to give us start by giving us a brief overview of what we've done so far. And I'm going to go quickly. As Nancy said, we're going to run out of light, so I'm going to go relatively quickly through the first. We're going to go quickly through the first part of this, so that we can focus on the more important part at the tail end of this. So we're going to work through the old-fashioned way with our paper PowerPoint. And again, this is our first public meeting. There will be 6 of them, and at each public meeting, we're going to tackle a certain topic. So tonight, floodwater management. All the other topics are over here, the other 5. So recreation and stewardship. Other topics will be recreation and stewardship, ecology and unique habitats, water quality. I can't read them all from here, but they all are in our PowerPoint here. Land conservation is another one. And so if we just go to the first and second pages here, you know, as it says here, we really want to keep this dialogue going with the public. And again, your input is extremely important and valuable, and we need it to make this a comprehensive plan. So I'm not as familiar with this, but this is a online reporting system called the Floodwater Reporter. And so you can read through this on your own, but as far as the instructions on how to use it, I'm going to stand because I think you might be able to hear me a little better if I stand.
Yes. Thank you.
And then that second page will show you again the 6 topics that we're covering, the dates of the meetings, where they are, and just some other logistics there. So just to give you an agenda of this evening, we're going to give a high-level overview of the plan and the project and our vision for the watershed. And tonight we're going to be developing plan recommendations and focused again on floodwater management. So first we're going to tackle the issue summary. So summary of the issues that we have come across to date, and we'd love input from all of you. And then we've started to develop management action recommendations, and we want your input on those as well. You know, are we missing anything? You know, particular areas that we should focus on. And then the next steps, we have created what we're calling a virtual watershed tour that's available on the website. You can take that. Again, I already went over the future public meetings. But again, we want you, there's a lot of opportunities not only through the public meetings, but online and virtually to provide your input. And that's really our goal. Okay, meet the project team on this page. I'm not going to go through all of this. You can look at this later. But this is the larger overall project team that's been involved in this, including municipalities, board members, select board members, legislators, town staff, conservation agents, etc. And then we have a smaller, what we call our project team, and there's 3 of us that are here tonight that are on the project team. But our project team consists of about 10 colleagues. So just to give you the high-level overview, the role of the management plan. This page here. Sorry, I don't have page numbers, so I'm going a little quickly. The management plan is really the big tent where we store all this information. It falls under this overall arching umbrella. And the plan will develop comprehensive goals for the entire watershed system. So it's kind of a holistic look at the entire watershed. And again, just to step back, this evolved out of reviewing. We've kind of been the researchers pulling together all this information that's been researched and studied for 40 years or so. So we're really pulling all this information together. And so again, we want to prioritize actions from the previous efforts to fit into the plan and those goals that were identified previously. Obviously, other recommended actions are going to come up, and they have, and so those are being included. And a significant contribution of the plan is to see where we can balance potential competing interests and identify where there may be co-benefits to those. So obviously, if you're going to try to manage water supply, you also want to make sure there's enough water for wildlife, fish, etc. So we were trying to look at those and try to find a balance between those needs.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I just hit the Zoom link. Are there 2 simultaneous meetings going on?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
That's
This is not this.
no. That's the virtual one, but it's the same material.
All right.
So an overall overview, of the project goals. Again, we're addressing existing issues, sometimes looking at them at different scales, but all in service of a watershed that supports human needs while also preserving natural functions and ecology. For example, as I just mentioned, seasonal drought within the watershed, we want to address that. We're looking at flow issues and constrictions in the Nemasket River and where those cause backups. But again, trying to balance those with human needs and ecological needs, recreational needs, everything, societal needs, economy, and all of that.
Question. So looking at the weeds, are they involved in?
They are a big part of, yes. And they will come up in other topics as well. Okay. So tonight we may not focus as much on the weeds, but they certainly will come up in water quality. I think they'll come up in every topic, quite frankly. Yeah. But yes, they are a big part of it.
Very good.
Okay, addressing dynamic forces that shape the future. For example, of course, climate change is going to be significantly important. All the issues that we've identified to date can only be likely exacerbated by climate change, so we have to look into the future and plan for that. And in our goal right now is we're looking at a high emissions scenario, really. So kind of basing that on what we anticipate, water levels, flood levels, precipitation, storm events, what that's all going to look like in 2050, and how we can address that as well. Also looking, of course, at development and where development is sited, etc. That's all going to be an important part of this as well. Oh, it's at the end of me. Okay.
So
Helen's now going to take over.
Yeah, we're going to switch off here. Yes, so I apologize if I go through some of this quickly, but we do want to cut the most important part is to hear from you guys, so we try to balance that and but the information is in the packets. There's a big project webpage, so as I go through this, if it's fast, always can refer back to this after. So there's some specific figures here on the 2050 climate change scenario that we're planning for in the context of this watershed management plan. We want to think about immediate needs, but we also want to understand how can we act now if we know that there's going to be extra flooding, if we know that there's these extra impacts coming. We got to start preparing now. And some of those impacts include things like 15 to 30 additional days of temperatures over 90 degrees each year, an additional 2.5 inches of precipitation, especially in the winter and the spring. So there are some definite predictions for the northeast region of the United States in general, and then for our particular watershed that we're trying to incorporate into the plan and be forward thinking about. We're also trying to, another analysis that we've started is this map, the image you see here on this page. This is kind of a heat map of where a lot of development could go within the watershed in the future. So we're trying to understand, okay, if development is going to occur in the watershed, based on existing zoning, based on existing land development patterns, where is that development likely to go? So that's what we're trying to understand the natural predictions for what can happen with the environment, and also what we've kind of set in motion on the human and the development side for the watershed in the next decades. When we get to the end of this process, we envision a plan that's a living document. The Assawamsett Ponds management team is the stewards of the plan going forward and works to implement the different recommendations that come out of this planning process. A lot of the recommendations, there are kind of recommendations in motion happening right now. So there's things that we already know from previous studies, like for example, sedimentation in the upper reach of the Nemasket, that while we are trying to put a lot of recommendations down into this plan, we're also trying to start working on those right now. And we are getting started with partners at different state agencies to see, and local municipalities as well, to see how we can immediately start to affect change while we're developing these recommendations. When we started this process with the project steering committee, we started with a vision for the watershed. We said, okay, we know that there's a lot of constraints and that there's a lot of issues. When you think about 2050 and you think about the kind of watershed you want to live in, what would that look like to you? And so that's where we kind of came out with this watershed management, this vision statement. I won't read it out loud right now, but it basically it speaks to a lot of what Maria was saying before about the need in this plan to start to balance ecological needs, also with human safety and preserving property, all of the different stakeholders around this body of water and these bodies of water. How can we kind of represent all of those in balance? All right, so what we're here to talk about today, specifically, is the floodwater component. So we want to think about questions like, well, what is the flooding issue? We have we're using the 2010 storm as the storm of record. We've done a lot of work trying to go through the hazard mitigation plan, for example, in Middlebury had a very detailed description of where that flooding happened, on which roads, which neighborhoods. In Lakeville and other surrounding towns, we talked to the fire chiefs who were active at that time to understand kind of what their experience of the 2010 flood was, and we've been able to get a lot of their recommendations. As we go, we're compiling the places that we know flooded in 2010 into some maps so that we can we want to get the full kind of the footprint of where that flood was. So we're thinking about what are the existing issues, what impacts have already been observed, again, mostly 2010. And on the other side of that, right now we're talking about flooding, but in other topics, we'll also get into drought, extreme drought, because it kind of teeters between the two. So what's been observed, how is climate change likely to impact the issue? Basically, more water is what we're looking at, more extremes on either end. More water some years, more drought in other years. And so these are some of the questions that we're trying to talk through, including what can we do on the ground to put in fixes, what can we physically do to the earth or to different structures surrounding the ponds. Also, what can we do on the regulatory side? So there's a lot of these recommendations that kind of, they're like the air we breathe. They influence everything we do. So if we can influence the regulations, we might have a better outcome. So in the APC region, I'm sure as many of you are aware of as residents, there's just some certain characteristics that make flooding particularly challenging here. One is the low gradient, the low topography of the Nemasket. One is the way that the natural system, way before the dam, was likely way more integrated with the wetlands that surround the pond, especially at the headwaters. Right now, all of that is being channeled into a very narrow spillway at the dam. So there are some existing conditions that really are kind of priming the pump for flooding issues. The next page here. All right, this map, this flood high hazard area map. It's also the base map over here where you see the different greens and oranges. This is the Fema floodplain, the high hazard area. Fema maps can tell us a lot. They can tell us what properties might be at higher risk, but they are backward. They're always a little bit static. They're kind of backward thinking in that they're using data from previous decades to try and say, look, this is what we have observed and this is where we're at right now. They aren't necessarily the best planning tool, because the 100-year storm in particular, what was a 100-year storm in 1990 is now the 50-year storm or even the 10-year storm. So there's always these moving targets. So we like to reference these maps, but they aren't the be-all and end-all of like the forward-thinking planning that we're trying to do. And some of that, again, we tried to use the most. We're trying to ground truth what the FEMA maps say. Did flooding actually occur in the special flood hazard area in 2010, or did it happen a half mile from where they're supposed to be flooding? So these are the kind of things that we're trying to look at.
Ellen?
Yes.
Could you just come over this way a little further? Thank you. So that the microphone picks you up. All these cars going by are making it really difficult. We want everybody to be able to watch this on LakeCAM later on. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I'm just gonna go.
There's fine.
Yeah, you can do that. We're
Sorry, I'll
good.
block you guys.
Actually blocks me out. It's a better view for the people at home.
So climate change impacts on flooding. We already kind of went through that. So there's more detail on this slide with in particular it's about the precipitation, but I will let everyone read that later. What I do want to mention really quickly is the co-benefits of flood mitigation. So if we're trying to balance out, if we're trying to prepare so that we can better prevent flooding always happens, right? Flooding is a natural process. It's been happening since before we built houses. Kind of the rub is when you combine natural flooding processes where rivers and water bodies routinely, will overbank during certain storms. But now they're doing that at the development interface. So it's kind of that conflict between where the water wants to go and where historical development has happened. So we're trying to, as we kind of lessen the flood impacts on those properties and try to dissipate some of the flooding that can occur, we might also cause positive benefits in other areas. So for example, if we were to reconnect the wetlands at the headwater with some of with the ability of that, a slightly more easier threshold for the dam to, for example, overtop during certain storms where you need that outlet. If those connections can be better established between the ponds and those surrounding wetlands, that's going to have both positive impacts for floodwater storage, but also for the ecology of that wetland, right? Because that wetland relies on periodic inundation. So we're kind of, someone said today, feeding two birds with one hand, and that we're trying to solve one problem, but we're also positively influencing another aspect of the system. Same thing with water quality. If we're able to sequester runoff and to treat some floodwater with better storage and better kind of direction of that floodwater, it will be able to infiltrate and get some natural filtering rather than running off straight into the pond. So we're trying to, where we can, make positive change across multiple dimensions. Okay. So we have developed with the project steering committee and our past research we've kind of compiled the top list that we've thought of so far, just as the local experts on the steering committee or the technical experts that are also on the steering committee, things that have come up in previous plans. We're trying to combine all of that together, and we've done some kind of preparatory work of writing those down, and we've categorized them into a couple of different categories. So potential management actions for floodwater. On the one hand, you can better try to store the floodwater, give it a place to go to that doesn't conflict with that development, where it has a chance to sit and infiltrate and more slowly return to the system without causing damage. You can help the floodwater flow. So right now, one of the issues in the system is that water has difficulty moving. It pretty much goes out one place, and that's the Nemasket. And the ability for it to kind of flow through that pinch point, combined with the topography, and some of the other damming and other issues along the Nemasket's course, there's some key areas where helping the floodwater flow. Also, the culvert between Long Pond and Assawampset Pond is another one of those pinch points. So trying to just get the natural hydrology to flow better might also help alleviate some of the flooding pressure when it occurs.
You just have to be careful of the weeds flowing.
Yes.
Through.
Yes.
That's a major issue.
Absolutely. Yes. Absolutely.
So opening the culvert would positively increase the.
I'm sorry, what did she say?
There's the issue of if you do that one culvert between Long Pond and Assawampset Pond, On the one hand, flooding might better be, water could flow better and maybe alleviate some flooding around Long Pond if it could move through that culvert better, because right now it's pretty undersized, it's pretty pinched. At the same time, we don't want to open up that water exchange and then have invasives from Long Pond enter Assawampset Pond. So anything that we do to change that kind of that doorway between the two ponds, we would first need to consider what impacts that it would have. We don't want invasives to spread. At the same time,
because that would hurt the water supply.
Exactly. So it has that would be multiple negatives that we don't want, but we do somehow still need to phase the work in such a way perhaps that we start to address that issue, so that then that water exchange has less chance of if we front load the invasives issue, we can then maybe address the flooding the flooding exchange between the ponds.
That sounds.
Once we.
Because if the weeds weren't there would be no reason not to increase that.
Does Assawampset not have weeds?
It has,
yes, it does.
It has
of course
some,
it does.
Yeah.
And it's in the Nemasket River too.
Right.
But it's definitely not it's not as pervasive as it's on.
When you did the dredging at Nemasket, is that still clear? Were they?
Tom, do you want to speak to that? The
Eco-harvester?
Eco-harvester? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah, Brent, yeah.
Yeah. We had a test eco-harvester project.
Tom?
Oh.
Talk loud, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
We had a test eco-harvester project on the Nemasket River.
It was very impressive looking.
It was, and we feel it was very successful. We can't say because we have to see how many years down the road it's going to be, but in our test preview, we were allowed to clear a channel, keeping 4 feet from each side of the bank. And the eco-harvester pulled the invasive weeds up by the roots. And you'd be surprised, like if the milfoil was 10 or 15 feet and the root ball was like this, they had some fine filaments that stretched another 3 feet. That's what really impressed me, how deep this is.
Wow.
Plus, we don't know because over 100 years since the water supply has taken over the headwaters of the Nemasket River and it's been dammed up. When we have periods of low water like 2015, 2020, the weeds grow exponentially.
Yep.
Okay, and then when they die, they're all down at the bottom. We don't know how many seeds are there or anything else, but as far as pulling up the weeds itself, very successful. In 2 days, they pulled up approximately 120 yards of Eurasian milfoil.
That's it. Yeah, the video was fabulous.
Well, thank you.
I've been in touch with them too.
But in the main reason that we did this project is to kind of kickstart to show that something could be done in the river. Now, and again, our preview was for herring, because we lose, everyone thinks, when they think about herring, everyone thinks about the springtime, the adults. But it's in the fall when all the fries start going down the rivers. And we have a lot of fish kills because it's just weed choked. There's no discernible current there. And at night it just gives off CO2. It kills them. So, but in that respect, it was successful. We took an area that had no discernible current, and I have film on it, and everyone knows we can see it. It has discernible current now. So that will help with flow in the river. But I mean, the main problem is at the headwaters, the sedimentation. It's combination sedimentation and weeds.
Can you just state your name and your organization?
Oh, sure. My name is Tom Barron, and I'm on the Middlebury Lakeville Herring Fishery Commission. I'm the vice chair.
Very good.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nancy.
Thanks.
We've been in touch with that company that did that, and they say they could do things in Long Pond.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah. I wanted to get to the matrix, so I am going to kind of just leave this to be, but I just wanted to mention that as we think about potential actions, we are also thinking about those regulatory mechanisms that I mentioned before. And so we're looking at particularly the 4 pond-side communities. We're doing kind of a cross check between the 4 of what's the local wetlands bylaw say. We're interested to see where do towns align with the rules that they're using around the ponds. So that's what we're kind of trying to get at here. So we're doing that. We're looking at the wetland bylaw. We're looking at the floodplain bylaw. All 4 towns have a floodplain bylaw that was recently readopted as part of a FEMA map update process.
So we're trying to kind of understand, you know, looks like every town in the district has a floodplain overlay district, but some of them prohibit different activities that others don't. So we're kind of trying to get a nice like section of how those regulations come into play in each town. And the last regulatory slash kind of planning related thing we're looking at to compare across towns is the different hazard mitigation plans that might be in place. So yeah, there's some notes about each town. All right, so we're gonna get to the activity. As we transition there, we're gonna bring some boards around. Basically, what we're gonna do is kind of just present some of the potential management solutions that have been brainstormed so far, or kind of come out of research. We're looking for your reaction to them, where you think they might be problematic, where you think that they would be positive, and also if we missed any, because you know we have some expertise, but you guys have most since you live around the system. So that's what we wanna try and understand tonight. And I will put in a plug as everyone sets up back there. We do have a project website. It's gonna have the meeting of the Zoom version of this meeting. It'll have a recording of that. It has a bunch of information about the project, about the different public meetings, about the research that we've done to date. So that's all kind of accessible there. And yeah, in this COVID age, you know, obviously it's not normal for us to have two simultaneous meetings, one Zoom, one in person, but we are trying to just make everyone as safe, comfortable as possible, have multiple opportunities. And so if you do want to, especially the map opportunity here, it basically presents you with a map, and you're able to take a point and place it on the map and add a comment. So if, for example, you experienced flooding in 2010 at your home or any other time, you could go onto that map and say, yes, this happened to me here at this, you know, you can leave some information about that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, who will start facilitating the activity.
And I've moved everything up because I wanted to make sure that we had good angles on everything for you. And I'm going to ask my colleagues to go in and sit with you guys because this is a collective planning effort. We've said right from the beginning, Helen said this is a living plan, which means you guys are a part of it, you guys are a big part of it, and you own it. Once it's done, we're all going to try to help to...
Who do you represent?
Pardon?
What organization are you
You didn't give your name.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Bill Napolitano, I'm with Southeastern Regional Planning, Serpent.
Okay.
Okay, I thought we had introduced up front, but yeah. So you guys own this plan after we finish it. We're going to work with you, but the words, the actions, the things that we work on, it's going to come from you. Because if it doesn't come from you, then it really doesn't work. It's not a plan. One of the things that I know we compete with dogs, planes, cars, radios, children, but we can do this. All right. One of the things that Helen mentioned about the matrix is that it's really born, the issues that we're going to cover are born out of public meetings, public contact, research, people's comments from previous meetings. Like I said, technically, we're into year 2 of this project, but it's year 3 because many of you have been with us right from the beginning when we started the flood management study. Before we did the Assawamsett Pond study, kicked into that. So this board, like I said, all these issues came from these meetings. And what the colors are great on the matrix because it really kind of cues people in on this stuff. The actions are going to be listed here. The potential benefits, co-benefits, partial benefits, or detriment, potential detriment or trade-offs, bad trade-offs, are going to be color-coded. These are co-benefits. This is a benefit, both benefit and trade-off, both present, the blue. The green is a co-benefit, and this is kind of what they call an inverse trade-off. It's going to be in your handout there. It's like, it could be, I'm a lefty. So this is going to be a problem. Okay, because I'm going to write like that. Okay. I'm a lefty. So these are trade-offs, and it could be something that, you know, you might win the battle but lose the war down the road if we're not careful, if we don't integrate what we do and how we do it. So the issues that have come out of this so far on possible management actions, we start out with make rules that limit dangers from floodwater. Well, Helen went over that. Most people have floodplain management bylaws, things like that. I have to do this, okay. So we're going to pursue regional participation in FEMA's, these are actions again that came out. Pursue regional participation in FEMA's community rating system program, which can help lower the flood insurance for the town if you meet certain parameters with the regulation. Review MOUs with different state agencies like with Mass DOT, the MBTA, Marine Fisheries, if you have them. If you don't have them, it's a good idea to maybe create them. That really call for maintenance. It affects drainage, water flows, and look at where outfalls occur. And that's happened before. Mass DOT has a great 5-year work and maintenance program. They address that, they clean outfalls. Adopt the local stormwater bylaw. Support efforts at the state level to increase the size of the storm that must be designed when you design culverts. That's a big thing. They call it design storm for the size of culverts, and it's old. The standards, we're working off of 1950 standards mostly. Things have changed. And what's really changed in communities is more impervious surface. There's more plazas, there's more pavements, there's more parking lots, things like that. Things that have become developed. It used to be, virgin land. But we haven't accounted that for in our design storm on how we design culverts. Consider and adopt transfer development rights, which is a little more complicated, but identify and codify more stringent construction standards. And those are things you got to look at too. How you do it, where you do it, why you do it, and if your bylaws even allow you to do it. Like put in nature-based solutions, like rain gardens, stormwater treatment facilities, nature-based stormwater treatment facilities. I'm going to say green roofs, things like that. But if you can't, even your development itself, if you don't allow for low-impact development, that calls for set-asides of open space, preservation, natural resources. If you want to do that, but your regulations don't allow you to do that, then you kind of hamstring developers into doing traditional cookie-cutter development, and it really doesn't work out for anybody, especially when you're near natural resource areas. But when you look at this, when you pursue regional participation in FEMA's community rating system, as far as water quality, it's going to be a benefit or a co-benefit. Drinking water supply, co-benefit, stormwater infiltration, housing habitats, land development, and inter-entity cooperation. Those are all potential co-benefits. And I'm not saying that it's easy, and I'm not saying it's for everybody. There are parameters that you have to meet. You usually have to manage it. Someone at the town level has to be the administrator. But it's a possibility. These are things we're looking at, and these are things that, again, the committee and the people, you guys decide. As far as MOUs with different state agencies and how we do things, why we do things, and when we do things especially. And Tom gave a great example. For years they've been trying to clean out the weeds in the Nemasket River because they saw it not only as a spread of aquatic invasives, but as a flow deterrent, a threat to fish and wildlife, a threat to flooding. So what do? You spend years trying to hammer away an MOU. What do we do? How do we do it? Who do we have to work with? And the same deal. That one had to go through the state, natural heritage. We talked to U.S. Fish and Wildlife about that. And federal government, state government. Endangered species. A lot of things. But some of these other things, like I said, Mass DOT has agreements with the towns. The conservation commissions, usually they have 5-year work and maintenance permits, where when they have stormwater, they can go in and clean their outfalls, things like that. They have to do it. So we have to look at who we have agreements with, where we need agreements, why we need agreements, and the agreements we have, are they working? Do people really address the permits that they have?
I guess I was jumping here and ask you guys, have any of you guys had, have you experienced that kind of regulatory layer of floodwater protection in your life or on your property? Have you had to consider the floodplain bylaw when you wanted to maybe make an adjustment on your property, or are you in support of some of these regulatory aspects that have come up? So are there any kind of town rules or state rules that you've come up against or that you're in support of when it comes to flooding? And I guess this category also kind of gets at maintenance issues. So is there anything that you've come across where you say, that outfall hasn't been cleaned in many moons. So like how, whose job is that? So kind of on that regulatory side or maintenance side, what's your kind of take been or experience been around the pond?
The biggest thing, do you want me to stand again? The biggest thing to address for all these homeowners was number one, after 2010, when FEMA came out and changed the floodplain, homeowners insurance went from $200, well, on one parcel that I know about, $200 up to $2,400. So that's a cost. For the most part, people can't afford flood insurance. All right, and as far as what has happened since 2010, the major issue that caused the flood, well, other than the storm, but the major issue is still there. You cannot drain the pond complex because the drain is clogged. So that issue is still there, and we're still trying to work on it.
That's kind of upon the management of the reservoir by the water authorities. So that's like irrelevant to climate or anything else like that. It's something like that. So.
On the flooding piece, I did sense because that does link to one of our recommendations. That kind of change, that jump in the premium cost. Basically, the program that Bill referenced earlier, kind of the first row, which I know it's hard to see, but that FEMA Community Rating System program. That's a program that a town participates in, and if they document certain actions, it brings down the premium for everyone in town by a certain percentage. So that can be a positive thing to pursue.
I think that it's important. I'm not sure that anyone's ever really come to Rob Sapersky, by the way, Lakeville on the lake since '83, long time. I'm not sure anyone's ever really come to grips on what the root cause of 2010 was. People said, people blame the Assawamsett Dam. Well, the water level was 3 feet over the top of that dam. People blame some poor guy in Middleborough, yet the Taunton River on Dean Street in Taunton was flooded, and Dean Street was closed. So I'm not sure, I think the best explanation was a hydrologist that came in from the state or from FEMA, and he basically said the ground is soaked. It's like a sponge, and that they're really, it doesn't matter how much water you pump out, it's just going to seep back in. And that was 20 inches of rain in 2 months.
I disagree with that. Don Stennard was and I was there in September of 2009, and I saw the water being higher than it had ever been before. And then Taunton opened up all the gates, and all it did is raise the river, and then we had to go and see if they could get Middleborough to open up the dam down in Wareham. And Wareham Street, and that person there at the time didn't want to do it. So the level of the pond, which is now the same height as it was in 2009, so we're being set up again higher. Or higher. So, one of the concerns we have is the regulation of not just the Taunton-owned dam on Assawamsett, because they've always responded pretty well, but if they open up all the gates, all of them except one is open now, the first one, the water just fills up the
But how do you explain flooding further down from that? I mean, Dean Street in Taunton,
it all goes down. It has to go down the river, and eventually, when the flood hit, because I'm saying if it was regulated better before the flood, for example, they have target levels of the pond. And if you look now, they haven't hit those target levels. And I'll tell you, in August, when it should be going down to their target levels, it was way higher than it was in June.
But it wasn't from the Assawamsett Dam.
the dam was locked up solid tight.
Yeah.
They didn't open that dam until, hi, and they didn't open that dam until just before the first hurricane was coming.
Right.
Yeah, and they opened up a couple of boards.
Yeah, I was there.
And then after the next one came, they opened up the whole thing, but then it was too late.
Yeah.
Because the whole thing just,
You can't drain it now.
you can't drain it now.
No.
And it's
Because the drain is clogged.
and yes, the drain is clogged, and you need.
So the cause is not necessarily the gate, it's the drain being clogged.
That's a good part of it, and because the drain is clogged, and one thing I think
It
we
can't
have.
catch up, is what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely. But so therefore, we have to be more diligent up front, so we don't get in that situation which we're
You're
in
not
now.
setting yourself up.
Yeah, this,
And I think the same thing about the culvert under Route 105-18. I think that, there's a clear flow through that right now, but it obviously is not enough of a flow to cause Long Pond to go down to the level it should be. But then there were 4 named storms this summer, plus an unnamed 4-inch storm.
Yeah, and even if you do the culvert, which would be good, if it can't go down Assawamsett, it's just gonna back up into a Long Pond again too.
I'd like to say something. Hi, I'm Ari Sky, Town Administrator. I was over at the Wareham Street Bascule just last week. I have video on my phone I could show you.
Eric, could you stand up and talk really loud?
Sure,
The camera's missing a lot of what's
Sorry,
going on.
I was
here.
over at the Wareham Street Bascule last week. I have video on my phone I can show you. The downstream from the Bascule, they are near flood stage already. So it isn't. What's happening right now is not a matter of a choke point at the Bascule keeping water out. Everything's going down. There's just too much of it.
Yeah, we missed that point.
Bob Dunn, Staples Road.
Nice and loud, Bob.
Okay, and the other thing I think that, picking up on what Donnie said, we found in 2010 that Assawamsett, the water level kept rising 6 days after the last rainfall. Because all the other ponds flow in there, and there's no way to discharge it. And as tough as it was on Long Pond and other ponds, it ended up in Assawamsett before it got discharged down the river. I've got pictures where my place is still surrounded by water 7 days after the storm that we had in March. That's another thing with Assawamsett that makes it unique. Everything flows in there.
Just to correct one point, in 2009, the Bascule Dam was wide open in November of 2009. It was open all winter long, and the only thing it did was drain the pond, that little pond on Wareham Street, above the Bascule Dam.
It was open in November?
It was open in November of 2009.
For how long?
All went until well after April.
That's what I've been trying to tell you, Don. You can.
And I know it because I was on the phone with the group when they decided to do it.
50 years ago, before we had 50 years of sedimentation and weeds, it made a difference. Now it doesn't. Like I said, the problem is in the river. We have a 3-foot gradient from the Assawamsett Dam to Bascule Dam. Okay, you have 120 years accumulation of once they stopped the steamship, the paddle boat running in the river, the Assawamsett, and they had men working in the river, and they put up a dam. So nothing has been done in 120 something years. Okay, so you have 120 something years of sand accumulation. The predominant wind, as you know, it's southwest, blows all the sand in. And then we had the weed problem too. So nothing being done in 120 years, the river's just filled up with natural eutrophication. And they did a study. They lowered the Bascule Dam, and it took over 30 days for water to go from Assawamsett down to the Bascule Dam. The problem is not a dam problem; it's a river problem.
But there are certain things we can try to do to restore the river and have the river interact better with Assawamsett Pond. So one thing we're talking about is so a couple of the actions are, for example, to restore the river channel, which would involve some limited dredging, right? So then kind of what Tom's referring to, trying to get some of the sediment out of, especially that upper reach reservoirs around that bend. Like there's some channel restoration efforts that can probably be done to almost to allow the water to flow better in that stretch. At the same time, another thing we're considering, or that has been considered in the past, and that might provide some relief, is to remove that Bascule Dam to gain, because there's such limited topography, at least you would gain the topography that's the difference between one side of the dam and the other side of the dam. So that would allow kind of a more steady flow.
More of a gradient?
More of a gradient.
Yeah, it actually would. I was talking to Tom about this too, and we were talking about removing sediment at the headwaters of the Nemasket. The Taunton River drops 20 feet over 40 miles. You have a 3-foot drop in the Nemasket over about 4.5 miles. You would improve the gradient in the Nemasket to be better than the Taunton River gradient, and the Taunton River flows all the time. If you get rid of that sediment, eliminate the pinch point at the MBTA bridge, and do something with the Bascule Dam, you'd probably restore the river gradient, and that would help. The other thing that happens to influence floods, and I always think about you guys on Long Pond, because something that you said is very true. 6 days after that 2010 storm, things kept rising. And that's normal flood, you know.
That was Assawamsett.
Yeah, Assawamsett, but I mean, just in the ponds area, everything keeps rising. And it's normal during floods. Rivers rise, they peak and crest, you know, later on. You know, the storm goes by, people think it's over. Now, the next 2 days, 2-3 days, it's going to be the worst. But what happens is, when you don't have a gradient, you don't have flows, just in normal weather and normal conditions, when you have high water and rains and flood, you get backwatering into those wetlands. So it's what, when you're talking about the geologist came around before, the hydrologist, and said the ground was saturated. The ground was saturated. It had been wet. And the wetlands hold the water, store the water, so when the storm comes, I mean, we're not going to do anything with, you know, 15 inches of rain in 4 weeks. I mean, that's, but you have no place to put it. It has no place to go. So the tributary streams backwater, the wetlands hold as much as they can, and then after the storm, they're going to start releasing them, because it's like a sponge. They'll start releasing it, and you'll still get the normal flows, and then everything else that's coming in from your floods. So you get that. One of the other things too, so we do have to clean the river, definitely. I've been on that boat for 40 years. We got to get rid of the sediment, we got to get rid of the pinch points, the invasives, you know, but one of the other things you got there is that everybody talks about water levels, and they're saying they're not maintaining water levels, they're not doing this and that. The water level is a voluntary marker. You've maintained, it's a recommended marker, but it's not a regulatory marker, which is why when Helen was talking about regulations and improving regulations, these are things, just like the MOUs we were talking about. Let's get, you know, marine fisheries a working maintenance permit so they can get rid of the sediment. That'll really help you, all of you guys out, you know, at the head of the river. Let's, you know, work with maybe the MBTA to go into the river and look at the bridge abutments to get rid of the pinch point there where their riprap has fallen into the water over the years, because that was supposed to be armoring for scour, the bridge abutments, and it didn't work out. It probably got blown out by the floods too. But you got to get in there and clean it out now, clean it, maintain it. But, you know, let's look at regulations that maybe say, here's a level that the water should be maintained.
I got to talk about that.
Yeah.
Anybody that lives on, I'm Phil Trombley, I live in East Freetown on Hemlock Point. Yep. And I got flooded out, what was it, 5 weeks? In the hospital, the whole, I mean, everything. Most of the people, now I was taught at that time, we started a lot of craziness in town meetings and in the Lakeville Library, and we had Canessa there, everybody was there. Yeah, well, yeah. We were meeting in some pizza house or something, right, Donnie? Yeah. But they were saying how 89.5 million gallons of water got to drop down to drop the pond 1 inch. And it takes 7 to 9 days for that to happen. Right? This was all the explanations. And then on April 11th in 2011, the 6 cities and towns agreed to have a cooperative to agree to the levels. Okay? Then in 2014, they came up with the new pond levels. And you're saying it's not regulatory. Me, I don't care. Right. Because if all the 6 towns agree to it, whoever's responsible for trying to keep the ponds at that level should make that happen, or try to. If it takes 9 days, once it gets to that peak, take some boards out. What's happening is it gets up, it gets up, it gets up. Now you're trying to drop 500,000 500 million gallons of water out of there. Now, New Bedford, I know, says we can drop 40 million gallons a day, but they're not going to do it because it's going to run through their sewer treatment plant. Think about this. You know what should happen down at Fort Tabor in New Bedford is they should put a Y right there before that and a pipe that goes right out to the ocean. If we're in trouble, everybody's property and safety and all the welfare of everybody, open that thing and dump 20 million gallons a day right into the ocean to lower the level if it's that bad.
I don't think they can process water through there without running it through the treatment. The water
You cannot right now. I know that. You cannot right now. But why don't they put a big Y there with a 12-inch pipe or something and just shoot it out? Because I know they can do. They don't want to run it through the plant because it costs a lot of money.
Sell it to
And it's,
Brockton.
huh? I didn't hear you.
Sell it to Brockton.
Do anything.
Do something. But the problem is, we all the towns agreed to these target levels. When they get to the target level, just take a couple boards out. So you're trying to do it within a week or they can't be. They can't be. Why isn't it? All the towns agree. Now Freetown even stopped, but I know Lakeville was still recording daily because I look at it. The pond level's above the target level. Now where's it been August? There's no August there. Why? Because it's so freaking high. In 2018, it was off the charts, and it stopped being recorded on their website then. Why? Because nobody wants to get in trouble because they're not lowering the water levels?
I do want to mention one thing. I'm sorry, just to maybe provide some larger context too, is that right now we have an engineering team that is looking at the upper Nemasket from the dam, the APC dam, down to Basco Dam, and they're trying to model, okay, how would you, what kind of a system would you need to drop the water? And it's not exactly, it's not what you're talking about through the supplier, but just over the dam. What kind of dam structure particularly would you need to drop that instead of in 21 days or 40 days, like maybe it's happening now, in 7 days or in 10, so in a much shorter time to get back below that flood hazard level.
Yeah.
And so without going, I don't want to put the cart before the horse because they're still constructing that model, but the very interesting kind of first task of that was to try to understand, was to look at the dam itself, to say, okay, right now you only have about 50 feet, and you have kind of the spillway is the spillway, and then you have this very extensive, for 1,000 feet on either side of berm, right? So what if that whole thing what if the opening was a bit wider, and what if it was a bit lower, so that as you're saying, no one would have to go necessarily pull a board as you were ramping up to that flood level. It would already be over, spilling over before you got.
Yeah, but I wasn't talking about a flood level. I was talking about the target levels where everybody wants the water to be.
Oh no, that's what this.
When
that's
it gets
what
to
this
there, just lower it. Now,
You still need a way to drain it, so a better infrastructure system might help.
I agree with that. I also agree that the weeds, the million tons of weeds that are in the ponds, they're taking up water space. So the water is higher because of the weeds are in there. I know that, and I really believe the weeds are the first thing. But, remember, second, the first thing should be an effort to not let it get above the target levels. That's it. That's it. And then everybody can work for years and years and do this wonderful stuff you're doing to fix it.
What if you found out that natural rainfall overwhelms any ability to control that target level?
It doesn't.
It does.
Okay.
20 inches of rain since July.
I know. But look at last summer. Look at last summer. We couldn't even put our boats on a boat lift because there was no water.
But
when that starts to come up,
is the pinch points are there.
I know.
But until those pinch points are removed, I don't think the system, regardless of any human interaction, is capable of handling these excessive.
Well, I agree to disagree because I believe that if their job is only to try to not let that get above the target levels, that's what we should do, and then let all these other ideas, which are all wonderful, I agree with them all, but you got to have that. Because we don't get scared till it's coming over. Thank you for your time.
Places that have a lot of variability in precipitation end up having these huge flood canals. Like California has these enormous flood canals, and Florida has these flood canals all over the place. And
Which is-
You know, it's not infrastructure that we're about to get.
No, but which is a great lead into the next topic, because we were talking about another thing that's come out of the talks. And I agree, you know, and what Helen said about the hydraulic and hydrological study, that's going to yield some really good results and some really good, give us some more options on what to do with the water. So we'll keep you guys up on that. So
Yeah,
that's good thing.
If you please leave your email, because there will be a public meeting specifically just about that study in November.
So we'll let you guys.
Why isn't somebody from Freetown on the board?
They
have no town staff on the board, according to the paper.
No, they do.
There has been an it would be great. It would be great to have more.
Freetown for a long time.
Yes, Althea. So there is one member that's on the team. What we did when we created this project is we did an extra round of invitations to town staff. I just don't think Freetown had having some transitions at the time.
Yeah.
They're welcome to send a delegate.
There was someone in the Upper Nemasket steering committee from Freetown at the last meeting too.
So they're participating as they can. We invite. No one is like leaving Freetown out. We just
But getting on to where you were going with infrastructure, the next thing that really came out with big recommendation, we kind of been skipping around, which is fine, but we were talking about build infrastructure that limits the dangers from floodwater. So we were thinking along those lines. So when you say people have certain infrastructure, you know, that we can't get, well, maybe we can. And we're thinking about that, and that's going to be part of the plan too. What can we do to change the infrastructure we have to make the handling of water, the movement of water, more effective and more efficient? Because that's the thing. You got a lot of water, you got to move it around. Okay, we talked about one of the things was elevate Bedford Street when you replace the culverts. By Lakeville, you know, we get the dip right before you get to the town hall, and then it goes up again. That's probably a very expensive option, but at least it's been thought of, and people have been thought about that. You know, if you're going to replace the culverts, make them bigger and arched culverts, elevate the street. And I've been part of projects in different towns where they've actually done that.
We can even call it a bridge.
Yeah, it's short span bridge, actually. That's what it becomes. Install green infrastructure to control on-site flooding and runoff. That's what we were talking about before. Like nature-based solutions for floodwater management. That works. It takes some maintenance, you know, maybe once a year maintenance to really look at it, but someone, you know, if you handle it, responsibility, highway department or whoever, conservation, it can be done. And what we could do, even with that, you look at flooding and runoff from properties, say abutting the river and the phase 1, South Coast Rail. You might be able to get some, you know, some mitigation out of them, actually, too. And they've been, you know, so far receptive to that. And then retrofit, you know, parking areas, install green infrastructure, swales, country drainage, you know, those types of things. And they help mitigate flooding on our roadways. That's the thing, that's the other thing too. I mean, if you can channel it, if you can infiltrate it, and you can manage it in your rivers and streams, especially your tributaries around there, what comes out of your wetlands, it can work. But it's going to take, that's where you're going to take the thought, the planning, the infrastructure look, see how things work with the hydrology, the topography. And again, some of these, I mean, when you talk about elevate Bedford Street, I mean, you know, don't worry about invasives. It's a trade-off there. You don't want to spread anything. You don't want to make anything any worse. You know, as far as water quality, drinking water supply, well, there's a trade-off there too, because the whole place is drinking water supply adjacent to it. But there are some co-benefits as far as stormwater management, ecology and habitat, land development.
Well, it wouldn't have a detrimental effect if they got rid of the weeds first.
We got to get rid of the weeds first. I agree. We got to get rid of the weeds first before we do culverts or bridges or anything. You got to get rid of the weeds because you don't want to spread the weeds. It's true.
Is it true that waterfowl spread the weeds?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they can.
So essentially, this is like, you know, closing the American-Canadian border so that each side doesn't give the other side COVID.
Yeah. Well, and then again, you know, boats can spread the weeds. And you got a boat ramp over there too that maybe we should address as far as a, you know, boat washing station and the whole bit.
Somebody actually posted on Facebook that he loved our boat ramp because he didn't have to wash.
Because he didn't have to wash?
Yeah, because he didn't have to wash.
That's a beautiful
and I
thing.
said, it speaks for itself.
He did get a little beat up by other people on Facebook for saying that.
And green infrastructure on site, nothing but benefits. Everywhere where people have implemented green infrastructure, nature-based solution on sites, nothing but benefits. Again, it's a little work, might be a little maintenance, but in the long run, you do get benefit.
Are there incentive programs for private property owners to do improvements like that?
The only ones I know of was actually, it was a tree planting and infiltration, like gardens, like rain garden. In one of the towns, they actually provided incentives for homeowners to do that.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really great idea. In other words, what can I do to make my property more resilient? And maybe then if you translate it to public properties, what can we do to the public property that we own along streets, along rivers, along ponds to make it more resilient? So those are the types of things we're actually looking for, thinking that way, and how they would affect you locally. You know, how becoming more resilient as a community will it help me in my situation where I am, my location in the community? And what types of things do you think, maybe have you thought of for your particular area? What do you need? I mean, are there culverts? Do road surfaces need to be, refurbished? Bridges, pavement, a lot of things like that really contribute to pollution, runoff, sedimentation, erosion, all of these things that will eventually, like Tom said, the drains clog. The drains clog because all this stuff finds its way into our waterways, and if we don't maintain our waterways, then it's just like having a bad drain in your house. And everything backs up, and if everything backs up, everything's at capacity before you have a situation where it demands you have peak capacity. And that's when you have real problems. And like you said, there's 120 years of sediment, 40 years of neglect as far as the plans we had to implement change. So now's a really good time. Actually, it's past the time, but I mean, now that we're more aware of what we can do, how we can do it, why we can do it, this is when we should do it. So again, these are some of the things we've come up with.
Highlighting the one at the bottom there is interesting. So, and I'm curious about your guys' reaction to this. So this is the elephant in the room of just trying to avoid the floodwater.
Yeah, avoid the floodwater.
So one way you do that is by not building new properties in the floodplain, or by buying out properties that have repeated flood losses. Not in a mandatory way, but in a way that, say you're looking to make a change, like the house isn't staying in the family. If someone would compensate you, would buy you out, so that could be returned to kind of a non-built situation. Is that something that
I'm surprised that the water authorities haven't done that, because that would, I'm grateful that I was able to, Jen O'Keefe, I'm on Stapleshire Road. We've owned it for 13 years. And I'm grateful that we have a house and it's in the flood. It's beautiful. But there's a reason why the state doesn't allow people to do that anymore. And this is the reason. And when we bought it, we knew that I could see the watermarks. I'm grateful that we have this opportunity. And I understand what it is, but I honestly am surprised that the water authorities aren't buying properties when they become available, and things like that. So, it is.
I have a question as it relates to that. Now, you're assuming that if there was no property there, that this excessive, and I mean truly, excessive rainfall that we've experienced would somehow seep in to the land, and I'm not sure that's true. There's an awful lot of Long Pond that's just steeply sloped.
Yes,
and that stuff is that water is running.
Right,
it's not like sitting
No,
down.
not that it would seep in, but just that you wouldn't have the conflict between the natural process and something that's built and that someone's trying to live in and protect and keep whole. So you're trying to eliminate that conflict by just saying, okay, we've seen that this house floods over and over and over again. Let's think about returning it to making it a natural setting again, or
What are the water levels like on the ponds that have absolutely no development, like the Codifying?
They're all high.
They're high everywhere.
Yeah,
So
it's not going to stop the flooding.
It's developed.
Yeah, no, that won't, it will just give, it just won't create that conflict between the property. No one will own it, so there won't be a vested interest, like someone's life, you know, like their life savings isn't in their house.
Yeah. What you end up doing is, you know, they tried to do that in the Nemasket. In the Nemasket up near Freshwater Brook, up that way, in Middlebury.
On the Taunton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, from the Taunton River and Freshwater Brook where the flooding comes in, yeah. But the purpose there too is to reclaim the floodplain, because what you can do is if you do have a buyout program, they've talked about this in Rhode Island too, they've had problems along the coast. They're talking about local buyout programs as opposed to FEMA buyout programs, like having things done locally either by the state, municipalities, as well as FEMA, and try to reclaim the floodplain. Just, you know, the capacity, no one's injured then, like Helen was just saying, and you let it return to nature. In some places, they actually try to restore it, like do, you know, restoration like a riverbank or a floodplain restoration project. So that's the whole, you know, kind of impetus behind that. But is that something that you guys have ever thought about locally? You know, starting a local buyout program or things like that, or would you support something like that, or is it kind of a non-starter around here, that whole idea?
I think it's a non-starter, because at least on our side of Assawamsett, what we're finding, particularly over the last 10 years, properties being sold, structure on those property are being demolished, and they're putting up 3 stories.
Yeah.
People are moving out on what was once basically a summer community is now pretty much a year-round community. So I don't see people giving up their waterfront property even with the liability of flood potential, because it's expensive, number one.
But if people did it voluntarily and the town or state owned it and didn't put another house up there, it could only benefit.
That would be the thing, yeah.
I mean,
that would be different.
Yeah, that would be
once the houses are up there.
Yeah. Yeah, if the town could buy it out, it'd be a benefit. It'd be reclaiming floodplain. Which, you know, like you're saying, probably some of these things probably should never have been built.
Oh yeah.
And now this is what happens. But it is. I was just wondering if it had been kicked around, if it was an idea that was considered. But if it's a non-starter, then that's going to be hard because you got to bring it to town meeting, something like that.
Every pond's different, but I'm just thinking in terms of the property value on compared to when I bought 25 years ago, and what it is now.
Yeah, and the market's going crazy now too.
Exactly.
Houses and land. All right, the other thing is, the last thing we wanted to talk about is possible management strategies, storing floodwater. And this kind of gets into what we just said. Restore and enhance wetland areas that act like a sponge to hold the water and slowly infiltrate the water back in, which is why you saw water coming back in 6, 7, 10 days after the big storms. You know, including retiring cranberry bogs. And we talked about that too, reclaiming cranberry bogs, and you've seen that. That's been really successful where it's happened. And then expand wetlands into upland so that disconnected and disjointed areas can be reconnected hydrologically. Because a lot of times what we do is we fracture nature the way we build. You know, we disrupt natural flows, natural systems. So those are a couple of things we came up with, and you know, the water quality is a big benefit. Drinking water supply, I mean, it's applicable, yeah. But stormwater infiltration, yeah. Ecology and habitats, reconnecting habitat. Land development, you know, trade off there. I mean, might lose some value if you're a landowner. But even the cranberry bog owners that have done that, like redone the cranberry bogs, it's beautiful. I mean, people go out there, they tour them the whole thing. Interagency cooperation, that's still out there because a lot of this is only going to get done through interagency cooperation, working with people, listening to people. Recreational access might be a trade-off depending on who owns it and what the purpose is and why it's set aside. And then public stewardship. You know, the wetlands and the whole bit, it really opens up an opportunity for a lot of stewardship. You know, you think about the commissions you have, and I'm going to pick on my friends from the Herring Fisheries Commission. You might say, yeah, well, they're the fish commissioners. They're stewards. They're stewards of that river and the resource that that river houses. Your Conservation Commission are the stewards of your wetlands and waterways. your agricultural commissions, or the stewards of your farms. We're all stewards, and I think a plan, and a good plan on how to confront climate change, respond to climate change, and also respond to everything that we have to worry about around the ponds and around our rivers and streams, that is basically a stewardship plan, because there's a role for all of us in it, and we are stewards, and we have to recognize the fact that we are stewards, and people have to recognize the fact that our volunteer commissioners are stewards, and everything that we can do to help them will help realize these goals for everybody and better everybody's life. So
Hi, I'm Deb Trombley from Freetown. One thing that I think is really important is just communication. Like there's no, as things happen, water levels rise, you know, we call people to find out, people are traveling around. It's a flurry of stress and worry because there's not one place to go. There's not, Lakeville has some information on their website, but then it's spotty. We don't know if, you know, boards come out, we call, we find out, we write down the date, then months, weeks, days down the line, whatever, you know, there's different opinions as to what was done. Instead of it being like maybe blogged or somewhere, somebody to call, some information, you know, there's nothing that is, you know, controlled. And I don't know if that's any way that Serpent could help, but, you know, it's different towns, so even relying on your own town doesn't help. It's relationships that you make, you know, people calling people, you know, this is a person to call to find out, you know, I called a person to find out if the boards were out. She was like, yes, came out 2 days ago. And you're like the 20th person that's called me. It's like, yeah, because we don't know. So that to me, communication and being able to go to one place and find out, you know, what the levels are, what kind of remediation is being taken, and maybe a couple phone numbers. Even you guys, we don't know any numbers or way to reach anybody or email addresses. So even like having that in your presentations would be very helpful to be able to reach out like, oh, you know, we listened to you and, you know, want to give you a call. So that's all.
One of the other things in developing the plan that we're coming up against sometimes is just like a lack of data, and it's not necessarily like you're saying, sometimes someone is collecting it, but maybe it's not just being posted or not being like aggregated the right way. I wonder if there is new technologies. For example, I know that the water supply, I think a lot of the times they have to send someone out there physically to check the water level, and they see if they mark it down. Like perhaps there's a different kind of water level gauge that is like more automatic. That would just be a different option than having to kind of, that could, you know, do that work of automatically updating a website or a blog.
What is the APC Management Board or whatever that? Who is that under? How is it funded?
The APC Management Committee?
I can do that.
Nancy can, I think. Nancy knows all about that.
Back in 2002, when we acquired Betty's Neck, the town of Lakeville acquired Betty's Neck, we also put a conservation restriction in perpetuity on all the waterworks property. Taunton, New Bedford, and Lakeville worked together to protect all that land for some of these same purposes, so that didn't become all housing all around there, because New Bedford had nothing that said they couldn't put a development on Quiticus if they wanted to. They owned the property. So the three towns came together, we protected all that land, we got $9 million from the state towards that purchase of the conservation restriction in that property. The state mandates you have a management plan. So the management plan for the Assawampset Pond complex was developed by Epsilon, an engineering firm, with all the maps and what was off limits and what was going to be open to the public. When money goes into public land like that, it has to be, certain parts have to be open to the public. And the management team is the team that has representatives from Freetown, Middleborough, Lakeville, Rochester, DEP, EOEA. There's like 7 members on the management team, and that they meet quarterly. That's in the management plan. They have to meet quarterly and talk about the number one priority is water protection. That's why we've got the money. It's drinking water. So that's how we got the money to save all that land around there. And the management team has been meeting quarterly since 2002. I'm Lakeville's representative. I'm also the environmental manager, so, and I've been on there since 2002, and when things come up, there's problems. We have people building fires, we have rangers. There's Andrea in the back, she's a ranger that patrols, keeps people out of the drinking water, and then we meet quarterly about some of the problems. And just to add another little thing, the water levels are going back on the town website. Taunton had lost a lot of staff. You know, with you can't, with the pandemic, it's nothing you can help. People left, they weren't replaced. So there was a gap, but we just got 6 months worth of information that went on, and now we're going to start getting it again monthly. So, and that Senator Roderick's actually helped with that because he said we need to get those going again.
When you talk about funding, Nancy, this maybe is a question for you. It's rhetorical.
Okay.
Both Taunton and New Bedford sell water to other municipalities. Is there any way, legislatively or whatever, or regulatory-wise, where a surcharge could be put on per gallon of water that goes out of either Taunton or New Bedford to Mattapoisett or Westport or Dayton or whatever, that could be used to mitigate what all you folks are doing here to help fund it? I mean, is that possibly legislatively that could be done? We're talking about, I was on the casino committee for Lakeville, and we haven't met in 5 years, thank God. But they were talking about the Taunton complex, where the third phases would be a water park. And my question was, where are they getting the water? Well, they're getting water out of Lakeville. So I think it'd be worth at least exploring legislatively if there's some way, not the water that New Bedford uses for New Bedford or the water that Taunton uses for Taunton, but if they're going to be selling water outside of those two cities, why can't there be a small surtax that goes back into what you folks are doing?
This is why we're having a public meeting. That's why all these people are here, is because all these ideas are going to start going into the second year of the grant to things that can be explored.
It might be a good way of seeing if some even if it was a penny a gallon, it could amount to tens of thousands of dollars to help with the weed problem in the lakes and things like that. It could only benefit the municipalities. I mean, we're kind of you talk about stewards, I mean, we're kind of the stewards. The people that live on the lakes, I think, probably care more about it than people who are turning the tap in New Bedford and Taunton. They take it for granted. We don't.
We can look into that because I think the Mattapoisett River Valley did that Aquifer Advisory Committee. That's what it used to be called. Now it's the Water Supply Protection Advisory Committee. They did that many, many years ago through the efforts. I think it was Jeff Osich, who was town planner, was the chairman then. And I believe he started out with a quarter of a penny.
Yeah.
Then it went up to a half a penny. And I think it's up to a penny.
Yeah.
But the money that it pulls
think of the millions of gallons of water.
Yeah, and the money that got pulled in, they used to actually buy land in the Mattapoisett River Valley aquifer.
Yeah.
And it's really helped them as far as set-asides go. And if they didn't raise a lot of money, enough to necessarily buy land, they used it to leverage other grants from land associations. So they could say, if you give us this much, we can pitch in this much and we can buy this land and protect it around water supply and recharge areas. So that's a great idea. And people, I haven't heard that kicked around in years. I mean, I'm going back 25, 30 years.
Well, we wouldn't be hurting New Bedford or Taunton feelings because we're not asking them for a penny, but if they're selling Lakeville water and Freetown water and Rochester water and Middleborough water.
You want a commission.
Yeah, exactly. A surcharge. Half a penny.
It goes through you. You get your half a penny. There you go. You'll be rich. But no, that's a great idea. Like I said, it hasn't been kicked around in years.
Especially if it's seen that the money is used. The money's
pretty
going
certain
to be used for good.
the situation in Fairhaven was a little bit different.
Oh yeah, it is.
They had to. It was for preservation of their own watershed for the specific water production.
The master well that's
hold on.
shut down.
Let me finish. Which they're allowed to do under the rules governing the enterprise fund because it's specifically for the water system. Yep. They don't have to be specific for the water system. You have to have a special act passed by the legislature allowing them to charge for work beyond the water system.
Right.
And that right now that would be contrary to state law. So you'd have to get a special act passed.
Oh yeah, you do. But it's something that could be kicked around again. That's all I'm saying. It's something that could be kicked around again. It hasn't been brought up. And Taunton has an enterprise system. I mean,
I also know from my experience that the amount of water that New Bedford sells outside of the city is maybe probably 10% of the total production, maybe 15%.
Yeah,
it's not a huge
much.
number. So you're not talking about a huge revenue source.
But they just asked for 2.5 million more gallons a day.
What do you mean?
There was a Conservation Commission meeting in Rochester,
Yeah.
of which legislation was passed or amended to provide New Bedford 2.5 million more gallons per
So
day.
buying 2.5 million more from New Bedford?
Yeah.
It's the Water Management Act permit, they had asked for an increase. So.
Yeah.
But I mean, any idea? I mean, it's something that can be kicked around. So it's it doesn't hurt to ask.
Right.
But yeah, Fairhaven did have extenuating circumstances. They had the Nascatucket well field shut down by saltwater intrusion too.
Mm-hmm.
But they were part of that multi-municipality, water supply area too. Most of their water came from Rochester after that. And most of the land that was bought with the surcharge came from the upper Mattapoisett River Valley and Acushnet, Rochester. So I just thought.
I think we're losing the light,
Yeah.
so we
Losing
need
the
to.
light. I think we're gonna kind of close like the formal meeting here, but we're gonna stick around. We want to hear, we'll continue to talk as long as you guys want to.